July. Durmstrang. Durmstrang was not a grand school by conventional standards. Its castle, a mere 4 stories tall, loomed over its vast and rugged grounds. Even in daylight, a lingering gloom pervaded the halls, giving the fortress an aura of quiet menace. Yet, despite its austere architecture, Durmstrang embraced an unexpected vibrancy. Its towers and domes bore the bold hues of orange and green, their striking contrast exuding both magnificence and solemnity. The same paradox extended to its students, who mastered the delicate balance between wielding dark magic and honing their defensive prowess, spear and shield in equal measure. Tewell Fawley stood at the highest balcony of the castle, leaning against the stone railing, surveying the school that had been his home for 7 years. The castle's modest size did not diminish its prestige. Durmstrang commanded expansive lands, bordered by jagged mountains and shadowy forests, with breathtaking views stretching beyond the horizon. Below him, the dueling grounds sprawled in the open air, designed for rigorous magical combat. The school held monthly duels for each grade, a tradition that tested skill and resilience. And then there were the school-wide duels, fierce competitions culminating at the end of the academic year, where the strongest claimed the coveted cup. A small smile curled at Tewell's lips. From today onwards, they finally have a chance to win. For 4 consecutive years, he had been undefeated. His dominance was absolute, only yielding during his first 3 years to upperclassmen who had since long graduated. Now, as he prepared to leave, a new champion would rise in his absence. Tewell, are you really going? The headmaster said the school is willing to offer you a teaching position. A voice cut through the stillness, followed by the rhythmic slap of bare feet against stone. Tewell turned to see a broad-shouldered young man approaching, his muscular frame glistening with sweat. Victor Crumb, fresh from a morning swim, ran a hand over his shaved head, droplets of water rolling down his arms. Durmstrang suits you better than anywhere else, Victor added. Tewell chuckled, shaking his head. And yet, you're the one who insists on training like a madman. Careful, Victor, you might age prematurely. Victor rolled his eyes, shaking off more water in retaliation. With a snap of his fingers, Tewell redirected the droplets midair, sending them splattering back at Victor with even greater speed. The younger wizard barely flinched, shielding his face with his forearm, unbothered by the harmless attack. Tewell clapped him on the shoulder. Study hard, Victor. I've decided to go to that school, but we'll meet again. Victor's expression shifted. I heard you turn them down 7 years ago just to come here. I had my reasons for coming. And now, I have my reasons for leaving, Tewell said cryptically. He wandered through the castle one last time, retracing the paths of his youth. 7 years of study, duels, and camaraderie had forged him into the wizard he was today. To outsiders, Durmstrang carried an infamous reputation. And truth be told, it was not undeserved. The school pushed its students to their limits, encouraging them to explore magic in its rawest form. Yet, despite its rigorous teachings, safeguards were in place. Durmstrang boasted one of the most advanced dark magic healing hospitals in the wizarding world, capable of treating nearly any affliction caused by reckless spellcraft. The curriculum followed a strict progression. The first 3 years focused primarily on healing and defensive arts. Only in the 4th year were students permitted to study dark magic under controlled supervision. Those who ventured too far into its abyss, driven by malicious intent, found themselves cast out. The school did not tolerate what it could not save. Still, public perception remained unwavering. To most, Durmstrang's very existence was an affront, its students irredeemable. The world had little patience for nuance. Tewell exchanged nods with younger students as he passed, acknowledging both those who embraced dark magic and those who abstained from it. Durmstrang was not as monolithic as outsiders believed. Upon reaching his dormitory, he found it unchanged. The same orderly rows of beds, the same neatly stacked trunks. His roommates had already departed, their belongings gone. He exhaled. It was the first day of graduation. The final night he would sleep within these walls. Shedding his crimson robes, Tewell slipped into more casual attire. His lean frame made even the simplest clothing look elegant. With practiced ease, he smoothed out the creases on his sleeves before lowering himself onto the bed, sitting upright, one of the many disciplined habits Durmstrang had instilled in him. He was waiting, time stretched thin, each second dragging against his nerves. Then, at last, a soft thud against the window shattered the stillness. His heart gave an involuntary lurch. A sturdy owl perched outside, its feathers ruffled from its long journey. It tapped the glass with its beak, eyes gleaming with patience. With a flick of his wand, Tewell unlatched the window, allowing the bird to swoop in. It landed gracefully on the chair, extending its leg. A letter. Tewell unfastened it, fingers running over the familiar parchment. His name and address were written with meticulous precision. Scandinavian Peninsula, Durmstrang Institute, 2nd floor, leftmost dormitory, Mr. Tewell Fawley. A quiet chuckle escaped him. It was almost identical to the letter he had received 7 years ago, save for the address. The same structured handwriting, the same formal elegance. A remnant of a past life, yet one that still ignited a flicker of anticipation in his chest. Turning it over, he traced the Hogwarts crest embossed on the wax seal. With a decisive motion, he tore it open. Dear Mr. Tewell Fawley, we are pleased to inform you that your application for the Assistant Professor of Dark Arts Defense position has been accepted. Your interview is scheduled for July 31st at 10 a.m. You will meet with Professor Quirrell and Professor Dumbledore. Please prepare accordingly. We await your reply by owl no later than July 10th. Additionally, you may choose to apparate to the school gates or use flue powder to enter the premises. Personnel will be available to escort you. Deputy Headmistress, Minerva McGonagall, ESQ. Tewell folded the letter, a slow smile forming on his lips. It was time to return to the place he once left behind. Tewell's heart finally settled. Yes, he was returning to England, returning to Hogwarts, the most prestigious wizarding school in Britain, to serve as an assistant professor of defense against the dark arts. It was neither an easy nor a safe position. In fact, it was arguably the second most dangerous profession in the wizarding world, surpassed only by being the parent of a Death Eater. If memory served, of the 7 professors who had held the post in the past 7 years, 1 was left permanently hospitalized, 2 were imprisoned, and 5 had met their demise. Yes, 5. The additional one, Alastair Moody, had survived only because he had never truly been the professor, his identity stolen by an imposter using Polyjuice Potion. And even he had eventually met his end. Given the grim history, it was hard not to question whether the position was cursed. For Tewell, however, it was merely another layer of risk in an already precarious existence. Just a little extra spice before his impending doom. He already had too many debts to fate to concern himself with one more. At 11, his life had taken an irreversible turn when he stumbled upon a ring. A ring imbued with dark magic so potent it could have snuffed out his life in an instant. Unfortunately, the curse bound to the ring latched onto him. Fortunately, it happened at the same moment he was transported to this world. And fortunately still, he had his own golden finger, a badge. It was a relic from his past life, carrying the crest of Hogwarts, the renowned British wizarding school. In its center sat a bold letter H, encircled by a lion, a snake, an eagle, and a badger. Beneath it, the motto read, Draco Dormiens Nunquam Titilandus. Tewell never understood why the badge had traveled with him, but when the dark magic threatened to consume him, the badge reacted, flaring with power and resisting the invasion. However, it was not strong enough to purge the magic completely. It could only keep him alive. That was when he recognized the ring, one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. He knew the story well enough to understand that even wizards as powerful as Dumbledore and Snape had been unable to counteract the curse bound to it. Dumbledore, one of the greatest wizards of all time, had ultimately chosen death rather than fight the irreversible effects. Faced with this, Tewell had made a choice. He abandoned the Hogwarts acceptance letter that had arrived at his doorstep and begged his parents to send him to Durmstrang instead, the school famed for its expertise in dark magic. Fortunately, his family had the influence to make it happen. For 7 years, he studied relentlessly, wielding his knowledge of dark magic to stave off death while relying on the badge's residual power. And in the process, he uncovered the badge's greatest secret. Its strength was tied to his magical knowledge. The more he learned, the stronger it became, compensating for the life force siphoned away by the curse. It was a delicate balance, like a reservoir with an ever-leaking drain, replenished only through his own growth. But last year, that equilibrium shattered. His progress hit a bottleneck. His growth slowed, and the badge's power gradually dimmed. 6 months ago, it vanished entirely, and the dark magic surged forward unrestrained. The reservoir became a one-way drain. Tewell fought desperately, drawing upon 7 years of study to compress the encroaching magic into a single point, a temporary reprieve. He glanced down at his right wrist, where a small black dot marked his skin, a thin line extending from each end. When those lines overlapped, it would be the end of him. At this rate, he had 2 years left. That was why he had applied to teach at Hogwarts this year. Because before the year ended, a certain magical artifact would be hidden within the school, a stone that granted eternal life. The Philosopher's Stone. As for why he had chosen defense against the dark arts, it was simple. It was the only position that opened every year. Even so, his Durmstrang background had made them hesitant to accept him. If not for his willingness to apply as an assistant rather than a full professor, he might have had to wait another 3 years. The position of assistant professor of defense against the dark arts was, for Tewell, both a poison and a salvation. Reflecting on his past 7 years felt like recalling a relentless battle against death. Days were spent absorbing every ounce of magical knowledge available. Nights were consumed by devising more efficient study methods. His obsession earned him a peculiar reputation at Durmstrang, the Panda War God, a name he hoped would never follow him beyond these walls. Tewell picked up a fresh piece of parchment and penned his reply. He folded the letter with meticulous precision, only for the owl to fidget as he tied it to its leg, twisting and shifting uncomfortably. It gave him a reproachful peck before flapping its wings and disappearing into the snowy horizon. "Sorry, buddy. I'll make it up to you next time." His good mood remained intact. With a flick of his wand, the 2 neatly packed suitcases on the floor became weightless, floating toward his open wallet. The moment they touched the enchanted leather, they compressed instantly, disappearing into its depths. The wallet, of course, had been secretly enchanted with an undetectable extension charm, its interior far more spacious than his entire dormitory. Such a modification was illegal under wizarding law. But really, could one even call themselves a wizard if they didn't break a few laws? Tewell cast a final glance around the room, silently bidding farewell to 7 years of memories before stepping out without hesitation. "So this is graduation?" A voice echoed from the staircase landing. It belonged to an aged wizard, immortalized in the grand portrait that adorned the wall. He was the second headmaster of Durmstrang, the one who had introduced dueling and war magic into the curriculum. The arena before the castle was his legacy. "Yes, Mr. Monty," Tewell replied. "Thank you for all your help these past 7 years." Despite occasionally reporting to the current headmaster, Tewell had always found Monty's advice invaluable during his nocturnal wanderings. "Durmstrang is making a mistake letting you go. That fool Karkaroff couldn't hold on to you," the old man huffed. Tewell smirked. "I need to push my magic further to explore new avenues." "I hear you're going to that school to teach." "Only as an assistant," Tewell clarified. "Well, all I can say is don't overwork yourself. Sometimes, pausing gives you a clearer perspective." Monty's eyes gleamed with meaning. It was not the first time he had spoken these words. And, as always, he refused to elaborate when questioned further. Tewell simply shook his head, bid him farewell, and stepped forward, leaving behind both his past and the school that had kept him alive for so long.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Hampshire Welfare Village. The village, named after the family, isn't particularly large. Aside from the sprawling manor at the end, there are only a handful of households nearby. What's more, these residents are all Muggles, completely unaware that within the towering fences lies a residence occupied by several wizards skilled in magic. Or rather, they can't even see the estate at all. A plethora of Muggle-repelling charms, along with ancient protective spells, shroud this place. Even ordinary wizards would only perceive it as an ordinary estate. According to memory, as a child, Tewell often ran around the village to play, disappearing before the astonished eyes of his companions. However, after doing this too many times, his mother no longer allowed him to tease Muggle children. At the peaceful entrance of the estate, with a light pop, a figure materialized. It was none other than Tewell, returning from a far-off place. However, before entering England, he had been transported internationally using a portkey. It must be said, long-distance transportation is much more convenient with a portkey. Unlike apparition, a portkey isn't a spatial magic for teleportation, but rather a rapid flight magic. Therefore, compared to apparition, portkeys are more energy efficient and safer. As soon as Tewell steadied himself, the estate's gates automatically swung open for him, and a diminutive elf stood behind, respectfully bowing to him. This elf had two bat-like large ears and eyes that protruded slightly. He was the house elf of the Welfare family, Jeff. However, unlike other house elves, he wore a clean and tidy white robe. Afternoon, Master Welfare, welcome home. The master and madam have been eagerly awaiting your return. The house elf's voice was somewhat sharp, and tears welled up in his eyes as he raised his head. Long time no see, Jeff, Tewell smiled. Initially, when he encountered the ring and was weak, it was Jeff who had always taken care of him. Although it was customary for house elves to care for their masters among wizards, Tewell, as a traveler, couldn't take others' care for granted. Therefore, after persuading his parents and Jeff, Tewell gave Jeff a robe, allowing him to leave the Welfare family and become a truly free house elf at any time. Of course, with Jeff's attachment to the family, Tewell couldn't drive him away. Wiping away his tears, Jeff should be happy to see the young master again. You've been away so long. Madam is going to nag for quite some time, he remarked. Thinking about this, Tewell began to feel a headache coming on, unsure if his father could help at this time. After pondering the whole way, he could only conclude that his father was entirely unreliable. Well, look who's here, the candidate for Minister of Magic. A finely featured woman leaned against the house's door, her smile unstoppable. Fortunately, time hadn't left too many marks on her face. She was Tewell's mother, Brenda Welfare. Upon hearing this, a simple-looking man poked his head out from another direction. Upon seeing Tewell standing at the door, his eyes lit up. He opened his mouth to speak, but was stifled by a cough from the woman next to him. He gave Tewell a pleading look before retracting his head. This unreliable figure was Tewell's father, Miles Welfare. Of course, it's your son, gentle, kind, beautiful, and elegant. Tewell emphasized the adjectives, then affectionately tapped Brenda's shoulder. Oh, stop it. Brenda turned and walked inside, her voice carrying a hint of tears. My son wouldn't stay away for 2 years. Oh no. In order to study the secrets of the curse, Tewell hadn't come back for a single day since last summer. Also not knowing why, the concept of family affection was particularly heavy at home. During his 7 years studying at Durmstrang, exhausted owls could fly around the estate twice. But to be honest, this feeling was heartwarming, especially under the pressure of racing against death. The warmth of family affection was the main reason for him to persevere. So Tewell didn't want to break this bond and become a different person. He caught up with his mother, wanting to explain the prepared speech, but at the moment he crossed the threshold, surprise! His father hid behind the door, jumped out with a wave of his wand, and the ceiling of the house was instantly filled with colorful fireworks of various colors. Jeff also jumped out from the side, shouting loudly, Congratulations, Master, on your 18th birthday. The originally bright house suddenly became dim. His mother held a large cake in her hands, with the twisted 18 written on it. With a breath, the candles on it were lit up, illuminating her face. It may not look very good. I tried for days and couldn't make it as good as your father's, but I can't admit it. Brenda threatened as she glared at Miles, who was chuckling on the side. No, I love it, Tewell said softly. I bet you dare not dislike it, Brenda teased herself. Before blowing out the candles, remember to make a wish. Wizards don't have the concept of making a wish on birthdays, but Tewell didn't know when he first came here, so he foolishly made a wish for a long life. Since then, making a birthday wish has become a tradition in the welfare family. With his hands clasped under his chin, Tewell closed his eyes and silently said, I hope my parents live a healthy and safe life. In the expectant eyes of Brenda and Miles, he opened his eyes, slightly leaned forward, gently blew, and the 18 candles were extinguished. With a flick of the cake, Miles skillfully caught it on the side, but Brenda didn't even look at her husband. She opened her arms and hugged Tewell. Happy birthday, son. Thank you, Mom. I'm very happy. Tewell suddenly felt a sense of guilt. The original owner had such good parents, yet he had replaced him. All he could do now was to do better than the original to alleviate some of the guilt in his heart. Don't be too happy just yet, Brenda smirked as she released her embrace. As a punishment for not coming home for 2 years, Miles timely handed the cake back. Just finish the cake. Tewell. So, at dinner time, Tewell sat at the table, enjoying the entire large cake alone, while watching his family, including Jeff, savoring the French feast his father had meticulously prepared. It is well known that the advantage of cake is that it is generally not too bad, but once it becomes bad, it is really bad, and taste alone cannot solve the problem. At home, Miles excelled in delicate French cuisine. Tewell, due to his past life, could also handle some Chinese dishes, and Jeff, as a house elf, was proficient in various European cuisines. But Brenda, even the famous British trio of fish and chips, she struggled with, let alone this cake she had supposedly been learning for a week. All right, come try your father's baked cheese fire crab. Brenda looked at her son's crestfallen expression, knowing when to stop, and brought the dish she had originally prepared for him. After 2 years, Tewell finally tasted his father's cooking again. It's quite bizarre, considering that his father, the head of one of the 28 pure-blood families, actually runs a French restaurant in the Muggle world. Fortunately, the welfare family is discreet enough, rarely interacting with other wizards, so it hasn't leaked out. But even if it did, it wouldn't have much impact on the family. Now that you've graduated, have you thought about what you want to do? Brenda suddenly asked, how about helping out at my restaurant? Or opening a Chinese cuisine restaurant nearby? Miles suggested, I've applied for a teaching assistant position at Hogwarts, Tewell said cautiously, avoiding mentioning that he applied for defense against the dark arts. Why do you suddenly want to go to Hogwarts? Brenda was surprised, even forgetting to put down her fork. Initially, it was you who insisted on going to Durmstrang. Durmstrang is too extreme. I want to take this opportunity to learn more diverse magic. Tewell had prepared this explanation in advance. Miles paused for a moment, not recalling the position of a teaching assistant. Well, that's not bad. But a teaching assistant? When did Hogwarts add that position? Both Miles and Brenda are Hogwarts graduates. Initially, Tewell strongly insisted on not going to Hogwarts, which troubled them for a while. I applied specifically. Otherwise, Hogwarts wouldn't let a recent graduate teach young wizards. In reality, Tewell suspected that Hogwarts wanted to share the curse of the defense against the dark arts, which is why they agreed to the application of a recent Durmstrang graduate. Hogwarts does indeed need an additional teaching assistant, or else the professors will be overworked. Miles nodded approvingly at his son's choice. Which subject will you be assisting with? Oh, Tewell swallowed hard, his words speeding up to the point where he couldn't even hear himself clearly. Defense against the dark arts. What? Brenda stood up suddenly, her chair falling to the ground as she pushed it forcefully. I won't allow you to have anything to do with defense against the dark arts. Seriously, You could hear that clearly? Tewell's jaw dropped. Of course, I'm your mother. Anything that vague definitely spells trouble with the course. Brenda said, hands on her hips, her eyes red with anger. I absolutely won't allow you to touch this subject. I went through 7 defense against the dark arts professors in my 7 years at school, and the worst one lost a hand. Miles quickly interjected. Tewell knows more about curses than we do. There must be a reason for choosing this course. Let's hear his explanation. If it were anyone else, Tewell wouldn't even have the interest to explain. But in front of him were his parents, who had supported him for many years. He needed a well-prepared reason. Do you remember what happened when I was 11? Tewell decided to comfort his parents with a kind lie. The truth is, I was under the same curse, but don't worry, the teachers at school helped me lift it over the years. You know, the teachers and Headmaster Dumbledore have some unknown history, so he asked me to try and lift the curse on this course. Even if I can't, it doesn't matter. After all, it's just a teaching assistant position, and the curse won't stick to me. Tewell had told his parents about the teachers before, and initially they were doubtful. Fortunately, he had always been able to dispel their worries by demonstrating the Patronus charm. But Brenda's focus was 7 years ago. So, during that time you were weak, were you on the brink of death? Why didn't you tell us about such an important matter? I'm your mother, after all. Brenda became more and more upset as she spoke. For a mother, the safety of her child is her top concern. As for the matters concerning Grindelwald and Dumbledore, she didn't really care. Well, she did care, but that was more about gossip. I was afraid you would worry back then. Tewell stepped forward quickly, embracing his mother, and now I'm fine, perfectly healthy. Miles also approached, gently releasing Tewell's hand and embracing his wife, whispering words of comfort. Tewell isn't impulsive. Even if there's danger, with Dumbledore at Hogwarts, he wouldn't stand by and watch Tewell get hurt. Besides, the welfare family has connections. It's possible to seek help from some knowledgeable wizards. The two continued their intimate discussion, ignoring Tewell's embarrassed glance at Jeff. If you need it, I can give you a hug, but please hurry up. I still have to clean up the dishes, Jeff joked. Thank you. Later, Brenda and Miles agreed to Tewell's decision. But it's only as a teaching assistant. If I find out you want to become a professor of this subject, I'll lock you in the cupboard for life. Brenda emphasized. This relieved him. His parents were his greatest comfort, and gaining their approval was his primary reason for coming home so soon. Sometimes he wondered, compared to other travelers who were alone, walking in a strange world with caring parents who loved him might not be such a bad thing after all. Before going for his interview at Hogwarts, Tewell stayed at the manor. Even though 2 years had passed, there were no changes in the arrangement inside. Jeff cleaned his room every day, so it was still tidy. But the bedding was new, as Brenda put it. It was time to turn over a new leaf after graduation. Life at the manor was simple. When his father had time, he worked as a chef at the restaurant in London, and when he didn't, he was with Brenda. As for Brenda, her life was even simpler. Shopping and watching movies were her main pursuits. Not at all like a witch, more like a carefree lady of leisure. Tewell spent his days at home. Compared to the militarized management of Durmstrang, life at the manor seemed more relaxed. But he wasn't uncomfortable at all. In fact, he felt even more at ease. At least there weren't any bothersome wizards coming to challenge him. He wasn't fond of wandering outside. On the contrary, his greatest hobby was reading in his room. He spent several days organizing his collection of books. If he became a teaching assistant at Hogwarts, he would undoubtedly stay in the castle. But that wouldn't happen until September 1st, the start of the school year. He could tidy up then. However, if Malfoy saw these books, he'd probably have him arrested without a second thought. Because the titles of these books didn't look very legitimate. Titles like Principles of Dark Magic, How to Properly Cast Dark Magic, Control of Beliefs, Enhancing the Power of Dark Magic, Origin of Curse Magic, and so on. Just the titles alone would be enough for Tewell to have a permanent room in Azkaban, and it would have to be a VIP room. At 11 o'clock in the evening, it was already late for wizards lacking nightlife. But for Tewell, this was just the beginning of his second phase of study time. Habitually staying up late, he habitually took out one of his books from his collection, Origin of Curse Magic. Since returning from Durmstrang to home, it seemed like the only difference was a change in the location of his reading. Finally realizing this strange phenomenon, he decided to try something different. The Welfare family's collection of books was still quite extensive, perhaps not as vast as the library at Hogwarts, where he would soon be heading, but there were more books on ancient magic. This was because in recent times, the family had become rather inactive in studying magic. Fortunately, they hadn't produced any wastrels, and the family business was thriving, showing no signs of decline. Tewell left his bedroom, the house quiet except for the faint glow of candles in the corridor. The study wasn't far from his room, or rather, his room was deliberately chosen to be close to the study. Among the 3 members of the Welfare family, only he enjoyed reading. Creak. The study door rarely opened. In the past 2 years, only Jeff occasionally entered to clean. The room was larger than Tewell's bedroom, and there were more books, with 2 shelves on either side packed with various volumes. So the entire room exuded the scent of old books, like freshly cut herbs, waiting for Tewell's arrival. The books here came in 2 types, those written in English or Latin, placed on the left shelf, and those recorded in ancient magical script on the other. Tewell had already finished reading the first type 2 years ago, so today his goal was the books written in ancient magical script. Durmstrang offered courses in ancient magical script, and many records of dark magic were written in this language. It could be said that ancient magic, compared to modern magic, was more powerful and less conventional in its usage, hence often considered dark magic. The books here were fewer in number and clearly more worn out. Some books even lacked covers, boldly displaying their titles. The 4 Elements of Magic, a rather peculiar title. The concept of elements didn't hold in this world. Tewell could use water like a spring or flame spells, and their power depended on his understanding of these 2 types of magic. In other words, while elements existed, they didn't affect the casting of magic. The notion of 4 elements was even stranger. In the eyes of Muggles, the 4 elements were the ancient Greek scholars' understanding of the world, believing it was composed of air, water, earth, and fire. But for wizards, it was a primitive concept of ancient wizards attempting to understand the source of magic, a staple topic in Durmstrang's magical history that Tewell learned in his first year. So, the presence of this book here piqued Tewell's curiosity greatly. You successfully captured my attention. The book wasn't thick, only a mere dozen or so pages. Taking it out, Tewell deliberately lit the candles in the study and sat down on the floor. If this book was nonsense, he would just put it back and pick another one. Opening the first page, as expected, it was entirely written in ancient magical script, with some magical reactions lingering on it. It wasn't that ancient magical script could store magic for such a long time. That was impossible. Over such a long period, even leftovers would have cooled down. The magic on it was because some ancient magical scripts had the ability to absorb magic, drawing on Tewell's magic as he read to protect the book from damage. That's why books written in ancient magical script could be preserved for so long. Of course, this protection had its limits. Tewell paused for a moment, recalling the knowledge of ancient magical script in his mind. Since it didn't contribute much to his strength, he wasn't particularly skilled in this area, treating it merely as a tool for reading. Fortunately, the content above wasn't too complicated. Any magic release boils down to 4 principles: magical power, form transformation, duration effect, and release speed. Magical power, referred to as Earth. There's nothing in the world more substantial than the vast Earth. The ground beneath your feet is no longer a constraint, but your loyal servant. Every spell cast carries the weight of the Earth. Form transformation, referred to as water. Water is formless, all within a single thought. Magic is ever-changing, with form transformations akin to water you mold at will. Whether it's fire like water or earth like wind, it's all under your control. Duration effect, referred to as fire, the fire of the soul, eternal and unceasing. Those who achieve this level are no longer bound by the physical shell, possessing an almost eternal soul. Release speed, referred to as wind. Everything moves with the wind, going as the heart desires. Those who excel in this aspect can make their thoughts 100 times more agile, returning to the essence of magic. This was Tewell's first encounter with such a theory. These 4 principles in the magical world were like the basics of basics, all relying on a wizard's understanding of a spell. The deeper the understanding of magic, the synchronized improvement in release speed, form transformation, duration effect, and magical power. No one had ever thought to break down these 4 basics and improve them individually. That would be a waste of time. But the perspective of this book was more like mastering one key point, which could enhance one aspect of all magic without the need to understand individual spells. It was like understanding that 1 + 1 = 2, naturally grasping that A + A = 2A. However, the problem was that the 1 and in magic were not the same. With curiosity, Tewell continued to flip through the pages. However, the subsequent content didn't provide any explanations or methods to bridge the understanding gap between different magics. It mostly introduced the power of these 4 aspects, also mentioning that achieving the extreme in all 4 aspects could break the constraints of space and time, becoming a deity beyond the world. Tewell immediately lost interest, basically concluding that this was a nonsense book filled with the superficial understanding of ancient wizards about magic. If he handed it to the history of magic professor, he could probably come up with a test question, but for him, it didn't even qualify as leisure reading. Yawning, he regretted wasting time on this book and decided it was time to go back to bed. Standing up, he rubbed his slightly sore thighs. The candle on the desk had gone out at some point, and sunlight was streaming in through the window, casting a golden veil over the room. But Tewell shivered. He clearly remembered only seriously reading 1 page. The rest was just a superficial glance. There was no way he could have spent the entire night on it. "Master," Jeff opened the door to the study and smiled when he saw Tewell. "I didn't see you in your room, so I came here. But you should take care of yourself." "Jeff, what time is it now?" Tewell searched his memory, effortless for a master of occlumency. Jeff paused. "It's 7 in the morning. I wake up at this time every day. 8 hours." He'd spent 8 hours reading just 1 page. The last time he had this feeling was when his mind was under the control of a teacher. Back then, his thoughts were sluggish, but the knowledge imparted by the teacher was deeply ingrained in his mind, as if he were born knowing that magic. His brain was being controlled again. Tewell picked up the book again. The title remained unchanged, but there was an additional line below. "This is valuable material worthy of a lifetime of study. I leave these words in anticipation of the next person who can understand it. Rowena Ravenclaw." July 31st. Tewell arrived half an hour early, choosing to apparate directly to the gates of Hogwarts. The reason for opting for apparition over the more convenient Floo powder was purely because using Floo powder was always somewhat inelegant. Tewell didn't want to appear covered in soot in front of anyone, especially considering that every person at Hogwarts was someone he needed to treat cautiously as a former Death Eater. Moreover, under the influence of his teachers, managing his image in front of others was always more important. However, he arrived a bit too early. The gates were closed, and there was no personal guide, as mentioned in the letter. He sighed in resignation. Because of the appearance of Rowena Ravenclaw's name, Tewell had been studying that strange book during this period. However, there had been no instances of his mind being controlled, and the content of the book hadn't been substantially helpful. It was all just general information, almost more superficial than his graduation thesis in his past life. "Good morning, you must be Mr. Fawley, right?" Tewell muttered to himself, and at that moment, an elderly but graceful witch appeared beside him. The witch wore square glasses, had black hair twisted into a high bun, and wore a meticulously tailored dark green robe, giving off the aura of a stern teacher. "I am Minerva McGonagall, the deputy headmistress and transfiguration professor at Hogwarts. You may call me Professor McGonagall." Sensing Tewell's scrutiny, Professor McGonagall introduced herself promptly. Tewell's dusty memories suddenly resurfaced. This Professor McGonagall was renowned in his previous life, but unlike the portrayal in the movies, her expression seemed a bit more aloof. "You can call me Tewell. Would you mind showing me the way?" Tewell smiled warmly at Professor McGonagall. Seemingly softened by his demeanor, which was less characteristic of a Death Eater, Professor McGonagall nodded slightly, her lips relaxing. "Professors Quirrell and Dumbledore are already waiting for you. Let's go inside. I hope I'm not late." Tewell followed Professor McGonagall into this long-awaited dreamland. Professor McGonagall didn't bother introducing Hogwarts to him, merely responding casually, "They are looking forward to this interview." Her expression still seemed somewhat aloof, as if his affiliation with Durmstrang Academy irked her. Tewell wondered what Dumbledore thought about it. Hurriedly walking through the castle, the usually mischievous staircases behaved themselves in front of the deputy headmistress, naturally leading them to the 8th floor. "Lemon sherbet." McGonagall uttered the password. The gargoyle at the entrance jumped aside, and the wall behind it split in half, revealing a slowly ascending spiral staircase in front of Tewell. "Go on in. They're waiting for you in the headmaster's office." "Thank you very much for your guidance." Tewell bowed slightly and then ascended the stairs. As the staircase slowly ascended, reaching the top, a shiny wooden door appeared in front of him. He took 2 steps forward, and the door automatically swung open for him. Before him was a quaint yet exquisite circular office. Portraits of former Hogwarts headmasters adorned the wall to his left, all squinting their eyes, scrutinizing him as he appeared. To his right, there was a row of bookshelves and a curtain blocking his view. In the middle was a long table, adorned with some peculiar silverware that spun continuously, emitting puffs of smoke. Behind the long table, a crimson gold phoenix stood on a perch, tilting its head to look at him. Sitting in front of the table was a young man wearing a large scarf, his hands clasped together on his chest, occasionally trembling. And behind the table, there was an old man with a white beard. His long beard was partially obscured by the table, and his bright blue eyes shone through half-moon spectacles, fixedly gazing at Tewell. "Welcome, my friend from afar." Dumbledore approached Tewell with an agility that belied his age, circling around the table to stand before him. "Albus Dumbledore, the current headmaster of Hogwarts." Dumbledore maintained eye contact with Tewell, but the latter didn't feel uncomfortable at all. "Tewell Fawley, I dare say. Even young wizards who haven't started school yet know your name." Tewell calmly shook hands with this legendary figure, meeting the first white wizard with no sense of pressure, feeling surprisingly relaxed. Perhaps his experience in such situations was extensive? "Please don't say that. Such praise is too heavy a burden for an old man," Dumbledore said with a smile, turning to the cloaked man. "Let me introduce you. Quirinus Quirrell. He will be the new professor of defense against the dark arts." Quirrell had been standing aside, his facial muscles twitching as he forced a stiff smile, his gaze evasive. Even his body trembled slightly when shaking hands with Tewell. "I heard that there would be an assistant. So excited that I could hardly sleep." His speech was stuttered, and Tewell had to exert twice the effort to understand. "I'm also looking forward to working with you, but we still need the approval of Headmaster Dumbledore, don't we?" Dumbledore chuckled lightly, not speaking, but gesturing for Tewell and Quirrell to sit down. Once they were settled, Dumbledore waved his wand and asked, "What would you like to drink? Tea, pumpkin juice, or perhaps some wine? I heard Durmstrang students like to drink." "That's just a prejudice from outsiders. In fact, not all Durmstrang students enjoy drinking. Personally, I prefer a glass of pumpkin juice right now." Tewell locked eyes with Dumbledore, his gaze seemingly suggestive. Dumbledore, lost in thought, waved his wand again, and a glass of pumpkin juice floated before Tewell. Eager to taste the famous pumpkin juice, Tewell took it and had a sip, immediately brightening up at its sweet and creamy flavor. "It seems you really like pumpkin juice. Do you need me to send you some? I have a whole barrel full." Dumbledore noticed Tewell's slight reaction. "Seems like you enjoy playing on the edge." Tewell sighed. Prejudices against Durmstrang seemed deeper than he had imagined. Even Dumbledore was somewhat guarded. "No, thank you. I prefer not to overindulge. I rarely see Durmstrang students who speak as eloquently as you. Seeming to tire of cryptic conversation, Dumbledore suddenly got straight to the point, especially Durmstrang students who apply to be assistants at Hogwarts. As far as I know, you're the first to do so. So I'm curious. Can you satisfy my curiosity? Tewell anticipated that his status as a Durmstrang student would pose some obstacles, but he didn't expect it to become Dumbledore's biggest source of suspicion. He couldn't just say he was craving his Philosopher's Stone. Learning, Tewell's mind raced, but he maintained a gentle smile. I have no intention of disparaging my alma mater, but Durmstrang is somewhat behind in certain areas of magical research. So, I wanted to come to Hogwarts to learn what I've been missing while serving as an assistant. Dumbledore leaned forward, his slightly narrowed eyes glinting with sharpness. But as far as I know, you refused Hogwarts 7 years ago and chose the magical school farthest from home in Europe. Now, 7 years later, you've decided to return to Hogwarts. It's hard for me to believe you're here just to learn. Moreover, Durmstrang's curriculum isn't bad, at least enough for you to survive in the wizarding world. Dumbledore's implication was clear. You chose Durmstrang originally, and now you're scheming to return to Hogwarts, especially after graduating from Durmstrang. He wasn't convinced of Tewell's intentions. Tewell's smile faded instantly. It seemed like the mild-mannered Dumbledore from earlier was just a facade. The pressure of a landslide hit him, and now the true Dumbledore, with all his edges, was revealed. The real first wizard. He had anticipated difficulties in today's interview, but he didn't expect them to arise so quickly. Fortunately, he still had a card to play, that book. Calmly, Tewell reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, used the summoning charm to retrieve the book, and handed it to Dumbledore. I truly came for the study of magic, for the deeper magic recorded in this. Beside him, Quirrell saw Dumbledore's eyes narrow slightly, displaying a hint of surprise. Curiously, he stretched his neck forward. But Dumbledore tilted the book in a way that Tewell couldn't see the content. The headmaster's office was filled with the sound of Dumbledore flipping through pages. Tewell kept watching Dumbledore's expression, ignoring the uncertain Quirrell beside him. Dumbledore's expression matched Tewell's expectations. He was first impressed by the contents of the first page, then involuntarily flipped to the next page, revealing a disappointed expression that Tewell had anticipated. But Dumbledore clearly wasn't being controlled by the book, as Tewell had been. On the contrary, he noticed it right away. This book has a rather peculiar magic. Dumbledore paused, wearing a smile reserved for dealing with students. The content is interesting, but I don't think a wizard like yourself will be fooled by such naive ideas. That's the normal reaction. Tewell chuckled lightly and pointed to the words reappearing on the first page, including that name, Rowena Ravenclaw. Dumbledore's smile froze on his face, his breath catching for a moment. As his smile gradually faded, Tewell felt a sense of relief. After a while, Dumbledore let out a long breath. I need to borrow this book for a while. Is that all right? Of course, Tewell had already memorized the entire book, but I'm not sure if my reason is acceptable. Hogwarts welcomes every sincere person, Fawley. I need to know if you have the ability to be a teacher at the school, even as an assistant. Dumbledore set the book down, covering the words with his hand, leaving Quirrell only able to see some letters. Tewell reached for his wallet again, but Dumbledore stopped him with a serious expression, reminding Tewell of the examiners during an exam. So, the next thing he said would be the exam question. I need to know what you will teach at the school, and ensure you won't bring Durmstrang's tolerance for dark magic to Hogwarts. Now, this was the interview. Tewell relaxed. He had long prepared for this. I applied for the position of assistant, but will the school's curriculum also require my responsibility? Tewell looked expectantly at Quirrell. He still maintained an interest in teaching students, especially the famous Harry Potter. Quirrell hadn't even finished his stuttering words before Dumbledore interrupted him. I've discussed it with Professor Quirrell, and he's willing to entrust students, including those below third year, to you. Quirrell didn't seem annoyed at being interrupted. Instead, he flashed a smile. Yes, I am happy to have someone share the workload. So, "I'd like to ask Professor Dumbledore, how do you think we can defend against dark magic?" Tewell smiled, looking eagerly at Dumbledore, who smiled back. The question was simple, so simple that Dumbledore wouldn't refuse it, so he didn't plan to wait for an answer. "It's by attacking." Tewell leaned forward with his hands crossed on the table, looking into Dumbledore's eyes. "As long as you defeat the enemy, you naturally defend against any dark magic. Simply attacking won't defeat the enemy." Dumbledore was indeed intrigued. He had reasons to enhance students' combat abilities. Tewell was here for this very reason. That's a given. Before attacking, learning defense is also essential. Can you believe it? Half of the employees at the Ministry of Magic can't even cast a decent shield charm, let alone master combat skills. So, in my defense against the dark arts class, I'll teach students how to avoid danger and defeat enemies as much as possible. Not just facing dark magic, but also facing malicious enemies. Tewell looked to Quirrell, who was watching the scene unfold. "Wouldn't you agree, Professor Quirrell?" "Of course," startled by Tewell's sudden question, Quirrell hesitated. "But we can't teach dark magic." Tewell sighed. Due to Durmstrang's tolerance for dark magic and the previous Dark Lord's appearance, people always held hostility and misconceptions toward the school. It's always been a misunderstanding. My alma mater not only teaches dark magic, but also teaches us how to resist it. If you don't understand it, how can you resist it? That's also why I agreed to have you as the assistant professor of defense against the dark arts. I hope you can teach students your understanding of dark magic in the right way." Dumbledore nodded approvingly. Tewell's face lit up with a surprised smile. "So, does that mean I passed today's interview?" "More than passed, I would say. It was very successful." Dumbledore reached out his hand again and shook Tewell's, but his eyes turned to Quirrell. "Quirinus, could you please go back first? Tewell and I have some things to discuss." Tewell muttered to himself as he watched Quirrell awkwardly leave the headmaster's office. He couldn't help but feel that Quirrell's behavior only made him more suspicious. It was like having the words, "I have issues," engraved on the back of his head. Well, scratch that. If it had Voldemort engraved back there, then forget it. Quirinus has always been a timid child, and there are reasons for his behavior, Dumbledore sighed. He was a bright student at Hogwarts, but I never expected him to encounter such difficulties now. Dumbledore sighed again, but didn't dwell on the topic any longer. "Do you believe in the contents of this book?" he asked, tapping the 4 elements of magic, causing the magical aura clinging to it to dissipate instantly. "I believe in Rowena Ravenclaw," Tewell replied. He didn't dare claim that the content of the book was correct, but if it was endorsed by Ravenclaw, there must be something worth exploring inside. After all, it was endorsed by Rowena Ravenclaw, hailed as the embodiment of wisdom. Otherwise, he wouldn't have spent so much effort on this book. Dumbledore shared the same sentiment. History didn't delve much into the 4 founders of Hogwarts, but every bit of it was worth pondering over. So, Dumbledore didn't dwell on that aspect, and moved on to his next question. "How do you view dark magic?" "Ah, now we're getting to the meat of it." Tread cautiously. Tewell deliberately pondered for a moment, not wanting to stand out too much. "Any kind of magic, as long as it's appropriate, can be used. However, dark magic can corrupt the mind, so at Durmstrang, those whose minds aren't strong enough aren't allowed to use it. So, I've always viewed dark magic with caution, harboring malicious intent towards villains. Isn't that justice?" Tewell's words were somewhat harsh, causing the elderly man in front of him to furrow his brow, but he didn't directly refute him. Using violence to combat violence cannot be considered justice. Evil people only need to bear the responsibility of their evil deeds, while good people must adhere to all the rules and regulations. "How come I didn't know you were such an idealist?" Dumbledore's words were rudely interrupted by Tewell, but didn't seem to bother him. In fact, the more he looked at Tewell, the more he saw himself. A younger, more spirited Dumbledore. Or perhaps Grindelwald. The old man was lost in reminiscence for a moment, but quickly shook himself out of it. "This book will stay with me. Feel free to come to me with any questions you have about magic, and I will answer them for you one by one." Compared to his teacher, Dumbledore had clearly accumulated much more experience over time and was in better health, which was exactly what Tewell lacked. So when Tewell saw this opportunity, he eagerly nodded in agreement. As Tewell left Hogwarts, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. He had expected Hogwarts to be in great need of a dark arts defense teacher, but the interview had turned out to be even more complicated and challenging than he had imagined. But the outcome was ultimately positive. He had officially become an assistant at the long-awaited school. Checking the time, he realized it was about time to leave. With a whoosh, Tewell disappeared from where he stood. When he regained his footing, the Hogwarts scene had transformed into a deserted alleyway. Stepping out a few paces, he spotted a dingy, cramped building with a simple sign hanging above the door: the Broken Cauldron Pub. People hurried past on the street, paying no attention to the small building. It wasn't that they looked down on it. Muggles simply couldn't see this magical establishment. As Tewell pushed open the door and entered, the pub remained calm, seemingly accustomed to people coming and going. "Guest or passerby?" asked a shriveled man standing behind the bar counter. As the owner of this small pub, he could claim to remember every wizard who came here, but there were few impressions of Tewell in his memory. Such a distinctive man was hard to ignore. In fact, Tewell had been here a few times, but over these 7 years, he had transformed from a gloomy student into an elegant gentleman. From initially fearing death to now facing the world with composure, his change was so drastic that it seemed like he had become a different person altogether. Tewell scanned the small pub and, not finding his target, approached the bartender, Tom. "I'd like to inquire about Professor Quirrell's whereabouts," he said with a smile, although he already knew the answer. "I won't casually reveal the whereabouts of Hogwarts professors," Tom grinned, revealing his decayed teeth. "What about Harry Potter?" As he left, Tewell asked, leaving the bar counter without a fuss. Tom informed him that the bar was dirtier than he had imagined. But this question quieted the entire bar. A balding little man nearby dropped his hat to the ground, but paid no attention, instead staring at Tewell with suspicion in his eyes. "Forgive me, sir, for inquiring first. Well, Mr. Potter hasn't been gone long after going into Diagon Alley. He's probably enjoying his shopping trip." Tom's smile suddenly turned ingratiating as he respectfully bent his hunchback. The people in the bar didn't sense anything unusual. Instead, they looked at Tewell with admiration. This wasn't the Imperius curse. Tewell had no intention of being sent to Azkaban on his first day of work. It was a confundus charm, albeit with a bit of soul power added to achieve this effect. In their minds, he had likely transformed into a figure as great as Dumbledore. But they would forget the specifics in 5 minutes. They would forget this little incident. "Thank you." Tewell returned a courteous smile and swiftly passed through the door into Diagon Alley. The bustling scene here was fitting for the central hub of the British wizarding world, a twisted, cobblestone street lined with various eccentric and thrilling shops. The road wasn't wide, which wasn't an advantage, but it helped Tewell spot his target immediately. Rubeus Hagrid and Harry Potter. As a half-giant, Hagrid's towering figure stood out on the narrow street like a fire-breathing dragon. Tewell had encountered many half-breeds of magical creatures. France had its share of Vila-human hybrids, for instance. As for hybrids like Hagrid, a mix of giant and human, he had no intention of offending, but even the bravest of Durmstrang wouldn't dare to entertain thoughts of crossing a giant. Just outside Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions, Hagrid suddenly rubbed his head and parted ways with Harry. Harry entered the robe shop, while Hagrid made his way to Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor. The shopkeeper there was quite influential, but Tewell wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He suppressed his excitement and quietly approached Hagrid, standing beside him in silence. Yet everyone ignored Tewell's presence, as if Muggles wouldn't notice the Broken Cauldron Pub. Coat pockets? None. Shirt pocket at the chest? Yes. Tewell's eyes fixed on that bulging pocket, knowing if he guessed right, the coveted Philosopher's Stone lay inside. He didn't make any sudden moves. Magic required adherence to basic laws, and no one would fail to notice a hand slipping into their coat pocket, especially a half-giant like Hagrid, whose resistance to magic was much stronger than a human's. Following Hagrid's gaze, Tewell witnessed Harry's first encounter with the magical world, reminiscent of his own first visit. The myriad of exotic herbs, exquisitely crafted brooms, playful novelty toys, and even the mundane cauldrons all seemed so fascinating. But joyful times always had to come to an end. As evening approached, Tewell watched as Hagrid, along with the somewhat crestfallen Harry, left the empty Broken Cauldron pub, but this time he didn't follow. Because when Hagrid purchased the Snowy Owl, he confirmed that the Philosopher's Stone was fake. A smirk crept onto Tewell's lips as he observed the bustling Muggles on the street. If a counterfeit, after being rigorously guarded at Gringotts and surviving a failed theft attempt, nobody would doubt its authenticity. Truly Dumbledore. The smile on his face grew more apparent, but his eyes became increasingly indifferent, looking forward to life at Hogwarts. September 1st. After putting away his belongings in his wallet, Tewell took the dark red robe handed to him by Jeff. The surface of the robe was black, but when placed next to black, one could see that it was a deep red, like coagulated blood. "Young master, it's time for you to go to work." Jeff smiled, his eyes shimmering with tears. In his memory, Tewell was still a little boy, but now he had grown into a professor who educates others. "Don't make it sound like I've done something extraordinary." Tewell half knelt down and gave the house elf a hug. "In my eyes, young Master Tewell has always been extraordinary." Jeff whispered softly. Arriving at the gates of Hogwarts once again, Tewell noticed that the place seemed a bit cleaner, as if it had undergone a meticulous cleaning. And the gates were wide open. Was this Hogwarts confidence, showing no concern that ill-intentioned wizards might intrude? "It seems you're ready to be a professor, Tewell." "No, I should call you Professor Welford now." Professor McGonagall glanced at him, quite pleased with Tewell's refined attire and appearance. Just based on looks alone, he could easily become the most eye-catching professor in the school. It was still Professor McGonagall who guided Tewell, but her expression seemed more relaxed and at ease. "In your presence, I am still a student," Tewell replied with a smile. During this period, he had been communicating with Professor McGonagall mainly to understand the teaching work at Hogwarts. To be honest, he was a bit surprised. Hogwarts' curriculum arrangement was not too strict for students, but it was much stricter for the professors responsible for teaching. There were a total of 7 mandatory courses in the school, each taught by a different professor, and now there was an additional assistant. These professors are responsible for the entire school's teaching work. But here we have 7 grades and 4 houses, except for the 6th and 7th grades, where students share a grade. The remaining 5 grades have 2 houses sharing class, adding that each course needs to be taught at least twice a week, with each class lasting an hour and a half. This means that the professors of required courses need to work at least 36 hours a week. And that doesn't even include grading assignments, lesson planning, and other miscellaneous tasks. Speaking disrespectfully, Professor Binns, who teaches history of magic, might have died from overwork. And the defense against the dark arts professor becoming an annual turnover might also be unable to withstand the high-intensity work throughout the year. Fortunately, Tewell applied for the position of assistant, only needing to teach grades 1 through 3. No need to wait until the end of the school year, and Quirrell also has spare time to go steal the Philosopher's Stone. How considerate. But why didn't I see your luggage? Professor McGonagall looked puzzled at Tewell, who was lightly dressed. The professors all live in the castle because there's simply not enough time to commute back and forth. I have a special little package. Tewell patted his pocket and winked at Professor McGonagall. Well then, let me take you on a tour of your future workplace, McGonagall said as she entered Hogwarts Castle with enthusiasm, cleaning the statues and armor as she introduced Tewell to Hogwarts. There aren't many professors at the school, so it's quite busy, especially for Albus. I'm mostly in charge of the school's management work, so feel free to come to me for anything. McGonagall's voice carried a hint of complaint, and Tewell didn't dare to agree. It shows that you've satisfied Headmaster Dumbledore in terms of management, allowing him to confidently entrust the school to you. Speaking of which, you're quite different from what I imagined for Durmstrang. McGonagall looked at Tewell curiously. Durmstrang in your imagination? Tewell made a gorilla-like gesture. Wouldn't that be the image of a rugged face covered in beard, speaking in a deep voice, with muscles all over, and exuding an aura of dark magic? McGonagall chuckled and shook her head. My mistake, but at least you're much funnier than I imagined, and you'll be very popular with the students. I hope so, Tewell replied. McGonagall led Tewell to a room on the third floor, located between Quirrell's office for defense against the dark arts and the trophy display room. This is your office. You can decorate it as you like, but not too eccentric, McGonagall said. Having worked with several professors of defense against the dark arts, McGonagall seemed to have seen many peculiar things. It shouldn't be worse than displaying specimens in the classroom. Tewell recalled the scene in the potion classroom in the basement. Even in Durmstrang, they wouldn't casually display those things. It's like writing "I'm not a good person" on their foreheads. Inside, it was spacious, with only a desk and some bookshelves, which Tewell needed to replenish himself. Further inside the room, there was another room, which was Tewell's bedroom. But the bedroom was not as rudimentary as the office. It was well equipped, with thoughtful touches like curtains with a Hogwarts crest. Since I wasn't sure what kind of office you'd like, I didn't take the liberty of decorating it for you. If there's anything you want to add, feel free to come to me anytime, McGonagall said. I'm very satisfied, even more than satisfied. I can clearly feel your care for me. Tewell nodded in contentment. It wasn't as good as his room at the estate, but it was still very nice. Compared to the cramped quarters of Durmstrang, Hogwarts Castle was noticeably more spacious. Even though there were more students, there were fewer professors, so the living space for professors was still ample. Professor McGonagall then proceeded to lead Tewell to the first floor. This is Classroom 11, where you'll be teaching the students in the future, McGonagall said. Tewell looked surprised at the classroom. His office was already spacious, but this classroom was at least twice as large. This is the largest classroom in the school, specially prepared for you by Dumbledore. He said you would need enough space for teaching, McGonagall explained. She added that this classroom was rarely used, and its vast area could easily accommodate a grassland. She was curious about what Tewell would teach in this classroom, but she figured everyone would find out once classes started. Tewell didn't explain, but he was quite satisfied with Dumbledore's thoughtfulness. Under McGonagall's guidance, Tewell had already roughly explored most parts of the castle, gaining a preliminary understanding of this ancient fortress. However, the specifics would have to wait for him to explore further. As night fell, McGonagall led Tewell to the Great Hall. Stepping into the hall, the clouds on the ceiling rolled and flickered for a moment, and the candles overhead lit up under McGonagall's spell. The magic here is quite peculiar. It's been like this since I attended Hogwarts, occasionally showing some clever changes, McGonagall explained. Very intriguing. The mystery of Hogwarts makes me look forward to the coming days even more, Tewell said, a smile creeping onto his lips. Time passed gradually, and more people began to fill the Great Hall. However, the first to arrive were not students, but rather the staff of Hogwarts. They seemed to have already discussed the existence of Tewell, so it was no surprise to see him in the Great Hall. However, their attitudes were different. A woman with long hair, dressed more like a Muggle than anyone else present, glanced at Tewell and emitted a light snort as she walked past him. Don't mind her. Professor Burbage teaches Muggle studies and simply doesn't understand much about Durmstrang, smiled the professor who was only about a meter tall, looking at Tewell. I'm Fawley, the Transfiguration professor at the school. Tewell Fawley, Tewell said, squatting slightly to speak with Professor Fawley. So, you're familiar with my alma mater? Professor Fawley burst into laughter immediately. I've been to Durmstrang for exchanges and studies before, mainly to learn dueling techniques, but I also learned about your attitude toward Muggles, which is indeed different from the rumors. You only prohibit students of Muggle descent from attending school. In reality, apart from that man, you don't discriminate against Muggles. Compared to certain individuals in Britain, your ideas are already quite good. Tewell wasn't here to correct people's misconceptions. After all, Durmstrang didn't care about others' opinions, so he allowed them to misunderstand. He was more interested in what Professor Fawley was starting to talk about. It seems you're quite skilled in dueling. Durmstrang rarely has external exchanges, so the fact that you could go there indicates that the school recognizes your abilities. That's all in the past. Professor Fawley waved his hand. After winning the Hogwarts Dueling Club Championship, especially after teaching at the school, there's hardly any time for practice. But I know you're the most outstanding graduate of Durmstrang in recent years. How about it? Do you have time for a friendly match? Professor Fawley's hand twitched eagerly, his face filled with an excited smile, as if years of anticipation had built up inside him. "I look forward to the opportunity to learn from you," he said. Tewell's muscles also trembled with excitement. At Durmstrang, there were rarely opponents who could give him a satisfying battle after 5th grade. He was eager to test his full strength without relying on certain magic. As the two of them with similar interests continued chatting, Fawley briefly introduced the staff present. "Hagrid is our groundskeeper, but he's currently guiding the new students across the Black Lake, so he hasn't returned yet." Tewell nodded, as if he were a novice, and could see shadows of his past life in these professors. Professor Snape was indeed gloomy, his eyes indifferent, as if wearing a mask that concealed his thoughts. His eyes flickered when he looked at Tewell. Then he slightly curved his lips, barely managing to form a smile. "I hope you can see the essence of the students, rather than just waving wands with them foolishly," Snape remarked. "No student is born knowing magic. We all start with foolishly waving wands, don't we?" Tewell politely retorted. The fact that a new professor, only a few years older than the students, dared to speak to Snape like this impressed the professors at the faculty table. Snape's smile widened ever so slightly. "Then I wish you smoother teaching." "Thank you, I'll do my best." The professor's attitudes toward Tewell improved slightly, and any lingering biases from Durmstrang were dispelled, except for Professor Burbage, who remained cold-faced. However, Tewell found himself enjoying the conversation more with Professor Fawley. He had no interest in potions, herbs, or divination. Only when studying curses directly related to enhancing one's power could he fully engage. Of course, as the most outstanding graduate in Durmstrang's history, he had the typical abilities of a top student and wasn't easily stumped by the professor's subtle inquiries. After some communication, they also realized that this young new professor was not only polite, but also had knowledge reservoirs no less than theirs. Compared to the stuttering churro on the other side, Tewell's performance was more like that of a true professor. At this moment, there was a commotion outside the Great Hall. Under the prefect's lead, students began to enter the Great Hall, and wizards from 2nd to 7th year sat at their respective house tables. Durmstrang doesn't divide into houses, right? Professor Fawley, sitting beside Tewell, asked with interest. "Yes, we are a whole, without division into houses, only individuals and the school as a whole," Tewell replied. Looking at these young wizards discussing the joys of summer vacation, it was difficult to tell the difference between the 4 houses from their expressions. Tewell wondered about the purpose of dividing into 4 houses. Was it to facilitate students forming alliances? Dumbledore, who had been smiling as he watched the students, seemed quite interested in this. "Tewell, what's your view on Hogwarts' house system?" Professors were accustomed to the classification of the 4 houses, so they were curious about how this Durmstrang graduate would view it. Tewell pondered for a moment before speaking lightly. "It's somewhat extreme. The new students are only 11 years old and can't really exhibit any particular traits. Dividing them into 4 different houses, rather than fitting their personalities, seems to mold them into students full of stereotypes under the influence of the houses. Especially with the competition between the houses, it can promote progress, but also easily lead to biases. These biases can overshadow other qualities that don't fit the house. Gryffindors can also become brave. Slytherins can indeed be loyal. Ravenclaw's thirst for knowledge is not unique, and the ambition of Ravenclaw's students also exists. But because of the existence of the house system, these traits are not recognized. In fact, they're all members of Hogwarts, and labeling them with fixed stereotypes is very unfair. After Tewell finished speaking, silence fell over the faculty table, contrasting sharply with the noisy students in front. After a while, Dumbledore applauded approvingly, bringing back to reality the many professors who had been lost in thought. They also lightly applauded Tewell. I am pleased to have a professor with different thoughts in the school. Eliminating the barriers between the houses is also what I aim to achieve, and it will require our collective efforts, Dumbledore said. Tewell, I look forward to the changes you will bring to Hogwarts. The sudden applause from the faculty table puzzled the students, causing them to pause their lively discussion and look at the professors with confusion. However, no professor came over to explain to them, and the next moment, their attention was diverted. The sorting ceremony was about to begin. Bam! 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 3 loud knocks echoed from the castle's doors, followed by Professor McGonagall leading a group of first-year students inside. Facing the students with their backs to the professors, they stood between the staff table and the student long tables. Professor McGonagall gently placed a 4-legged stool in front of the new students and placed a worn-out wizard's hat on the stool. As the new students looked on with curiosity, the hat twitched and a wide seam opened at the brim, resembling a mouth, and suddenly began to sing. You may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. This is the sorting hat. It can read the minds of young wizards, identify their qualities, and then assign them to one of the 4 houses. Professor Flitwick explained to avoid any confusion for Professor Flitwick. Quite amusing, but at Durmstrang, anything that can peer into minds and have thoughts of its own is generally considered. Professor Tewell paused to find the right word. Unusual. Professor Flitwick chuckled at this statement. We can't let the sorting hat hear that, he said with a smile. It's said to have been worn by Godric Gryffindor himself, but since it spends most of its time in the headmaster's office, it gets bored and spends its time thinking about the songs it will sing at the start of the school year. As for how it gained the ability to think, well, that's a question best left to the 4 founders. With the singing concluded, amidst the enthusiastic applause, the sorting hat bowed to each of the 4 tables before assuming its role as a regular hat, motionless, awaiting the arrival of the young wizards. Professor McGonagall timely arrived at the sorting hat's position with a scroll of parchment in hand. I'll call out a name, and whoever's name I call will come forward, put on the hat, sit on the stool, and await their sorting, she exclaimed loudly, then proceeded to read the first name on the parchment. Hannah Abbott. A girl with 2 golden braids stumbled out of the line. Though Tewell didn't know the girl, he recognized the surname Abbott. It was a pure-blood family name. After a moment, the sorting hat gave its verdict. Hufflepuff. A wave of enthusiastic applause erupted from the Gryffindor table, the largest in the hall. Some young wizards even stood up to shake Abbott's hand. The sorting ceremony wasn't disrupted by the cheers. Rather, the cheers were part of the ceremony. Tewell watched the sorting ceremony unfold among the young wizards, feeling like a tourist witnessing a spectacle in a magical world. Especially when a round-faced young wizard, upon hearing Gryffindor from the sorting hat, ran off without even taking off the hat, only to return amidst laughter to return it. As the sorting continued, waves of applause echoed through the hall until a particular name was called. Harry Potter. The entire hall fell silent as Harry emerged from the small crowd. Almost everyone in the hall turned their gaze to the slender figure. The 4 tables buzzed with whispers in unison. Potter, is he the one? Did you see the scar on his forehead? Which house do you think he'll be in? Tewell, who knew the answer, watched Dumbledore with keen interest. When Harry's name was called, the elderly man's expression changed slightly, and he leaned forward slightly. Obviously, he attached great importance to this special sorting. The sorting ceremony lasted longer than the previous ones, with everyone unaware of the conversation between Harry and the sorting hat. It seemed to go on for quite some time, perhaps half an hour, before the sorting hat finally spoke. Gryffindor. Harry, wearing the hat, finally breathed a sigh of relief. His legs trembled slightly as he stood up, his mind blank, but he remembered to return the hat. "I suppose you know this name, but I didn't expect Potter to end up in Gryffindor," Professor Flitwick said somewhat discontentedly. "Regardless of the house, he'll be your student, won't he?" Tewell responded with a smile. With the sorting ceremony concluded, Dumbledore left everyone with a silly, crybaby, dolt, twit, before the first feast of the school year began. Before Tewell could analyze, he was pleasantly surprised to find the empty plates before him suddenly filled with delicious food. This is the food magic left by Helga Hufflepuff. It's not conjuring food out of thin air, but accurately transporting it from the kitchen to the table. The thoughtful Professor Flitwick answered Tewell's confusion. Tewell was indeed unfamiliar with this type of magic. Food magic? Could it enhance one's abilities? But Hogwarts mysteries were on full display that day before Tewell. Unlike watching a movie, experiencing the myriad of magic as a skilled wizard allowed one to truly appreciate its intricacies. The food at the feast was prepared by house elves, including British classics like fish and chips, but also delicious dishes like roast beef and roast chicken. It was much better than expected. The food at Durmstrang was far from exquisite, mostly consisting of hearty or pickled dishes. Upon arriving at Hogwarts, Tewell even prepared himself to eat fish and potatoes for an entire year. No wonder Hogwarts was more renowned than Durmstrang. Its food alone was more internationally popular. After the main course came dessert, Tewell's favorite. In his past life, he had always enjoyed sweets, and coming to this world hadn't changed that habit. He eagerly tried every flavor of ice cream, every slice of pie, and every serving of pudding. Indeed, as long as desserts weren't overly sweet, there was no such thing as a bad one. Finishing the last spoonful of lemon pudding happily, Tewell keenly felt someone's gaze on him. Following the gaze, he saw Harry's eyes staring straight at him. Then Harry grimaced, clutching the scar on his forehead. Tewell picked up his wine glass, using the action to disguise his glance, but his eyes glanced at Professor Kirov beside him. Was it because of the influence of Voldemort's soul? It seemed their connection ran deeper than he had imagined. The soul was truly a profound subject. Tewell pondered briefly. However, this time, Harry was looking directly at him, not at Professor Kirov or Snape, but at Tewell himself. Raising his wine glass, Tewell smiled and met Harry's curious gaze. It turned out Harry had learned about his professor's identity. But to develop prejudice against Snape so quickly truly reflected the intertwined fate of this teacher and student. Finally, as the desserts disappeared amidst Tewell's regretful gaze, Dumbledore rose once again, and the hall returned to its original quiet demeanor. "It seems everyone has had their fill, but I hope you still have the energy to listen to a few words from this old man," Dumbledore said. "First-year students, and indeed all students, should take note. Students are prohibited from entering the forest on the school grounds. I am pleased to see everyone making good progress in their magical skills, but please refrain from indulging your creative thoughts in the corridors during breaks," he continued. "Secondly, do not enter the corridor on the 4th floor to the right if you wish to remain safe and sound within the castle for your studies." The hall fell silent in an instant. Lower-year students initially thought Dumbledore was joking and chuckled along. But seeing the serious expressions of the older students, their laughter quickly faded. Dumbledore noticed the students' reactions, but offered no explanation. Instead, he moved on to a more pleasant topic. "Let's switch to a happier subject. I have some good news to announce. In this academic year, we will be welcoming 2 new teachers. They are Professor Fawley and Professor Quirrell, who will share the position of defense against the dark arts teacher." Sparse applause echoed in the hall, but as Tewell stood up and signaled to the crowd, the applause intensified. Taking in Tewell's handsome appearance, a bold young which below shouted out, "Professor Fawley, do you have a girlfriend?" "All right." Dumbledore clapped his hands, redirecting the lost attention. "The new courses will begin tomorrow, giving you plenty of time to get to know these 2 professors." Dumbledore then waved his wand towards the sky, conjuring a long golden ribbon, his voice suddenly becoming more exuberant. "Now, for the final tradition before the end of the banquet, let's sing the school song together. Tewell looked on in surprise at Dumbledore's actions, unaware that Hogwarts had this tradition. So it seems that there are quite significant deviations between the plot and real life. But as soon as everyone started singing, Tewell understood why this part was omitted from movie. Hogwarts school song has no melody, besides the lyrics floating above their heads being consistent. Each person sings in a different tune. Under Dumbledore's magically guided conducting, this product of chaotic melodies surprisingly harmonized, resembling a musical ensemble. It was indeed something Muggles couldn't perform. After the song ended, students followed their prefects back to the common rooms. Tewell, having eaten and drunk his fill, bid farewell to his colleagues and returned to his office. At this moment, the office was not decorated at all and needed to be arranged by Tewell himself. The cleanliness of Hogwarts Castle was taken care of by house elves, but only in public areas. In private places like professors' offices, unless you have a specific need, the house elves wouldn't appear, even though they could apparate inside. Tewell placed his wallet on the table, opened it, and then waved his wand. The contents floated to their designated places according to his command. Besides books, there were a few cages containing some nice little creatures used for teaching students. After spending 10 minutes tidying up the entire office and bedroom, Tewell chose not to rest, but sat solemnly in his chair. He extended his right hand, and the small black dot on it turned into a tiny skull with a snake emerging from its mouth, the Dark Mark. However, it was much smaller than the actual Dark Mark. The skull seemed to come to life as the snake extended, attempting to coil around Tewell's wrist. In Tewell's perception, the dark magic within it was so intense that it almost broke through his protective spells. Immediately, he grabbed his wand with his left hand, aiming it at the Dark Mark. It was a small technique reserved for duels. When your opponent in a duel cannot determine your dominant hand, they are more likely to misjudge your strength. Life Shield. As Tewell finished chanting the spell, a surge of magic surrounded his wrist, forming a thin, golden membrane. The golden membrane gradually merged into the surroundings of the Dark Mark, and then the black snake seemed to hit a wall, slowly being squeezed back, leaving only its head outside. This was a variant of a shield charm that could exist for a long time, blocking the erosion of dark magic. Fortunately, he had chosen Durmstrang, and fortunately, his teacher had an extraordinary research on the shield charm. Speaking of which, besides studying dark magic, Tewell had learned the shield charm the most. But his heart did not relax because of this. There was only a year and a half left. This was unexpected for Tewell as well. The curse of the Dark Arts Defense Course, he knew, should not be so aggressive. It was probably touching upon the original curse on him, all set by Voldemort himself. The two curses worked together, instantly creating a synergistic effect greater than the sum of its parts. He was too impatient, choosing the Dark Arts Defense Course, which was the easiest to apply for, in order to get the Philosopher's Stone as soon as possible. To ease his mind, Tewell decided to go to the fourth-floor corridor tonight. Now that his life was almost gone, how could he not be anxious? Before leaving, he glanced at his class schedule. 2 classes per week, 3 grades, 4 houses. Well, there was at least 1 class every day. Truly worthy of Hogwarts. With a sigh, Tewell left a protective spell in his office. One should always be cautious. The castle was quiet at this moment, with only the torches in the corridor crackling softly. Relying on the light of the torches, Tewell cast a disillusionment charm on himself and quietly made his way to the 4th floor. Along the way, he was briefly interrupted by the moving stairs, but Tewell also sensed the mystery of the stairs. If you infused a bit of magic into the stairs and silently focused on where you wanted to go, the stairs would take you there. Conversely, if you were in a hurry, you were more likely to be fooled by the stairs. Tewell estimated that many young wizards could fall for it. Upon reaching the 4th floor, the corridor here lacked torches. After the distant light disappeared, it became pitch black. Lumos. A blue light emanated from Tewell's wand, illuminating the path ahead for him. This was a variant of the Lumos charm. The blue light wasn't actually visible to others, and to them, the corridor remained dark. In reality, the blue light expanded his perception, allowing him to see in the dark without drawing attention. The corridor here was not as deep as others, or perhaps it was noticeably shorter, as if a section of the corridor had been awkwardly cut off. And there, right in front of him, was the separated door. Tewell's hand reached for the handle, but suddenly pulled back. There was a disturbance. Tewell keenly sensed some movement near the staircase, not far away. If it were a patrol administrator or a professor coming, he could just hide inside. But if it were someone with the same goal, that wouldn't work. After a second of thought, Tewell decided it was safer to stay near the door, glancing around. There was a recess behind one wall. He moved towards it. As his body pressed against the wall, it gradually elongated to each side, covering Tewell inside, leaving only a semi-transparent membrane over his eyes. Quite effective transfiguration. Once everything returned to normal, a furtive figure appeared at the corner. Though his face wasn't visible in the dim light, the conspicuous large scarf on his head revealed it was Quirrell. Tewell hadn't expected him to be so eager. Quirrell's movements were no longer as hesitant as usual disguises. He briskly entered the corridor, immediately noticing its peculiarity. Lumos! The wand illuminated, casting light on Quirrell's eager face. Alohomora! The spell opened the door with a magic stone, not much different from the Gringotts' vaults being unlocked. It was like taking candy from a baby. The wooden door opened smoothly, prompting Tewell to silently mock the ease of it. Quirrell hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and went in. What happened next was beyond Tewell's view. His transfiguration could only alter the surface layer of the wall, as manipulating the structure itself, which had load-bearing functions, was beyond his ability. He figured only Dumbledore in the magical world could achieve such a feat. However, Tewell didn't have to wait long before he heard the sounds of spell casting and the snarling of an animal from inside. It must be the three-headed dog. The legendary three-headed dog was a creature of the underworld, tasked with guarding the gates of hell. While the magical world version of the three-headed dog might not be the same, it was still not something an ordinary wizard could handle. These creatures had strong resistance to magic, making it difficult to leave a magical mark on them. Combined with their immense strength, energy, and stamina, they were practically invincible in confined spaces. Wizards facing a three-headed dog usually adopted an attitude of can't beat it, can't avoid it. Luckily, Tewell knew the three-headed dog's weakness. Soon, the battle in the room came to an end, marked by Quirrell's hasty retreat. However, Quirrell's strength surprised Tewell a bit. The movies hadn't detailed his abilities. He always engaged in close combat with the Chosen One, turning to ash without resorting to magic. Yet, he had just confronted the three-headed dog for a while and emerged with only disheveled clothes, showing no signs of injury. It seemed his strength was not to be underestimated. Tewell sighed as he opened the door. The three-headed dog had barely finished a battle and was about to rest when, to its surprise, it saw someone approaching. The person even arrogantly gestured for silence. Shoo! Then, a harp suddenly appeared before its eyes and began to play automatically. As the beautiful music began, the three-headed dog's eyelids drooped. It tried to struggle for a moment, but gave up after a couple of attempts, succumbing and collapsing to the ground. Tewell moved the three-headed dog's feet blocking the trapdoor and, upon opening it, found the interior pitch black, even darker than the corridor outside, glowing and flickering. A bright sphere of light appeared at the tip of the wand, and then detached in its brightest moment. With the light brought by the sphere, Tewell saw the entangled vines below. Devil's Snare. Preferring dark and damp environments, it would extend its snake-like tendrils to entangle and strangle anyone who approached, then consume them. But the vines seemed to be very afraid of the glowing sphere. Even before the detached sphere approached, the tendrils automatically separated, allowing the sphere to pass through effortlessly. Using the levitation charm to propel his body, Tewell slowly passed through the Devil's Snare and reached the ground deep within. Before him was a damp, straight corridor with the sound of trickling water coming from both sides. He estimated he had reached deep underground. The corridor remained pitch black, but there was a bright light shining ahead. With the Lumos spell, Tewell confidently strode forward. Each checkpoint guarding the Philosopher's Stone was set up by the professors, and Tewell, being an assistant, obviously didn't have the qualifications to participate. The Devil's Snare was the handiwork of the head of Hufflepuff House, Professor Sprout. In the next room was the masterpiece of Professor Flitwick. There was a flock of birds shimmering with silver light, flapping their wings and flying around the room. This time, the door to pass through could no longer be opened with magic. Someone needed to catch the one correct key to open it. Next to it, they thoughtfully prepared a flying broomstick. Seeing this, the corner of Tewell's mouth couldn't help but twitch. Over the years, focusing on studying magic, coupled with the fact that he didn't have a talent for flying, he had never attempted a perfect broomstick experience. But he had his own method. Casting a spell directly on the key naturally had no effect, but what if he used magic to grab the key? Tewell looked up and searched for a moment, finding the old-fashioned silver key corresponding to the door in a pile of keys. Waving his wand, a small purple flame flew out from the tip of the wand like a rope, speeding toward his target. Sensing the ominous aura within the flames, the keys, including the correct one, anxiously scattered in all directions. But the flames, like a living entity, pursued them, wrapping around them and binding them after just a couple of twists. Strangely, the purple flames didn't exhibit any searing heat. They behaved like an ordinary rope, merely binding the keys. With the key in hand, Tewell opened the door to the next checkpoint. The way this farce was guarded was hard to accept, but it was all part of a plan. Despite knowing it was a trap, Tewell had to step into it. The next room was a giant chessboard, with black and white pieces distinctly lined up on either side, awaiting Tewell's command. The problem was, Tewell didn't know how to play chess. As mentioned earlier, he had devoted his past few years to studying magic, making him extremely unskilled in many things, especially leisure activities. However, this was within Tewell's expectations. He had come today to confirm the similarities and differences between the checkpoints here and those in the movie. It seemed his mere presence wouldn't alter the setup here. Time was running out, so Tewell retraced his steps back to his office. However, the chessboard problem still needed to be solved. Violence might be the simplest solution, but it was hard to believe Professor McGonagall wouldn't leave a small warning spell. That would be difficult to explain later. It seemed he needed to learn how to play wizard's chess after all. On the first day of school, also Tewell's first official day of work, he got up early despite spending a lot of time playing video games last night. The weather was nice today, and Tewell brought a book titled Wizard Chess Basics to the Great Hall. He had just borrowed it from the library, earning some strange looks and delaying a bit because Madame Pants, the librarian, hadn't opened the doors so early. There weren't many students in the Great Hall. They seemed to still be in holiday mode, not yet accustomed to the schedule of study life. The professors, on the other hand, were quite early. Quirrell sat at the edge, eating breakfast with a heavy heart, while Professor Sprout had already finished her meal, greeted everyone, and went to tend to the herbs in the greenhouse. "Good morning, Tewell." Professor Flitwick warmly invited Tewell to sit next to him. "I hope you didn't lose sleep from nervousness. It seems you have experience with this?" Tewell joked as he sat down. Flitwick chuckled along. "I don't remember my first day of teaching, but I still remember how nervous several professors at Hogwarts were when they first arrived. But this is the first time I've seen a new professor bring wizard chess basics," Flitwick continued, smiling. "Are you planning to teach wizard chess in class?" Tewell picked up a piece of bread from the table, carefully spreading blueberry jam on it evenly as he casually replied, "I just suddenly became interested in wizard chess." "Do you play wizard chess? We could exchange tips if you have time." Flitwick shrugged. Wizard chess wasn't his idea of fun. "I can't teach you that. I've never played wizard chess, but you can ask Professor McGonagall. She's an expert in wizard chess." Tewell pondered the scene of him asking Professor McGonagall for advice. "Professor McGonagall, could you teach me how to play wizard chess? How come you suddenly want to learn this?" "Oh, it's because I want to solve the chessboard you assigned." "Better not. Learning wizard chess from the person involved would expose myself too easily. Tewell shook his head, dismissing this impractical idea, and focused on his breakfast instead. It wasn't lavish, much less compared to last night's feast, but it was better than what was served at Durmstrang. Several Ravenclaw girls gathered together, whispering for a while before finally selecting one girl. Her face turned as red as her ears, and with the encouragement of her friends, she shyly but firmly walked up to Tewell. "Professor Fawley, can I ask you a question?" "Of course you can." Tewell had noticed their situation earlier and couldn't help but smile. "But that was already a question, so you've asked it." A puzzled expression formed a question mark on the girl's head, and the smile froze on her face. The other girls also looked baffled, staring at Tewell and the chuckling Professor Flitwick beside him. Flitwick laughed for a moment before speaking. "Professor Fawley was just joking with you, Penelope. Feel free to ask him anything." Then he introduced Tewell. "This is Penelope Clearwater, an excellent student from Ravenclaw." With the head of their house speaking up and seeing no sign of disagreement from Professor Fawley, Penelope gathered her courage again. "May I ask what you will teach us in class?" It wasn't their fault. The defense against the dark arts professors in recent years have been changing annually, and their courses were completely disjointed. As diligent Ravenclaws, they hope to be mentally prepared in advance. "What year are you in?" Tewell asked. Penelope didn't understand the implication of Tewell's words and hesitated before answering. "We're all in our 4th year." "I'm sorry then. I'm only responsible for 1st to 3rd year courses. For 4th year and above, you'll need to ask Professor Quirrell over there." Tewell shook his head. The girls couldn't hide their disappointment, and Penelope even let out a heavy sigh. She wanted to turn away, but was stopped by her companions behind her. They gestured towards Tewell before remembering the question they originally wanted to ask. "Oh, right, can we know your age? You look very young after all." "It's not some kind of secret." Tewell saw the expectant expressions of these young witches. "I just graduated this year, so I'm only 18. 18. Penelope was so surprised she couldn't speak. The fact that she and a professor were only 4 years apart meant that if Hogwarts had students repeating years, they could be older than the professors. "But if you just graduated, we should have seen you at Hogwarts in the past few years, right?" Penelope immediately sensed the problem. A handsome senior like Tewell would have been impossible to forget. The girls around her breathed a sigh of relief, thinking Tewell was teasing them again. But his next words surprised them even more. "Because I didn't attend Hogwarts, I went to Durmstrang." The scene fell silent. Penelope and her friends were shocked, their mouths gaping wide enough to fit an owl inside. Don't let Professor Fawley's youthfulness deceive you. He's the most outstanding graduate Durmstrang has ever had. Flitwick couldn't help but interject. He disliked people judging others by their appearance. During his early years, many wizards liked to mock his height during dueling practice. Although he used his stature as an unexpected advantage to teach them a lesson, it also formed a habit of not tolerating disrespect. The problem is, Durmstrang is a school that teaches dark arts, Penelope exclaimed, attracting the attention of the students in the hall who were dining. "So that's why," Flitwick shrugged indifferently. "Since Headmaster Dumbledore brought him in, it means you don't have to worry about being exposed to magic you shouldn't be exposed to." Compared to the students, veteran professors like Flitwick had long studied dark magic, but not as extensively as Tewell. In reality, once one reaches a certain level of proficiency, the magic they study no longer has clear distinctions between black and white. It's only the intentions of the users that serve as the method to distinguish between dark and light wizards. However, students fail to grasp this ideology. In their minds, those who use dark magic are simply dark wizards. Although there's no evidence to suggest that Durmstrang students will necessarily use dark magic after learning it, there's also no guarantee that Tewell hasn't dabbled in dark magic. So, the way Penelope and her friends look at Tewell is with the label of potential dark wizard, even worse than the impression they have of Slytherins. Tewell anticipated this situation. He knew that not only students, but also the British wizarding community as a whole holds a stereotype against Durmstrang, one that he couldn't change overnight. With Penelope's scream, the secrecy of their conversation was shattered. The whole hall buzzed with students whispering to each other, some even pointing fingers at Tewell. Despite prefects trying to maintain order, they couldn't stop the students from discussing him. I never expected a new professor to come from Durmstrang. He's only 18, just 3 years older than me. It should be normal for the defense against the dark arts professor to know some dark magic, right? How can he teach us defense if he doesn't know dark magic? Too bad Professor Tewell only teaches 1st to 3rd years. I wonder if I can stay back just to attend his classes. Even with Tewell's thick skin, he couldn't withstand such discussions from the students. He decided to leave and head to the classroom where he would teach soon. His first class of the day was with the 3rd years, both Gryffindor and Ravenclaw together. The classroom had no extra decorations, just a teacher's desk and some tables and chairs arranged at the front. There was a large empty space left behind, waiting for Tewell's arrangement. When George and Fred Weasley arrived at the classroom, it was already filled with their classmates for the joint lesson. You see what you did? Giving the fainting fancies to what got us chased for a whole half hour. Fred nudged George with his shoulder, displeased. Don't worry, we haven't started the class officially yet, George said mischievously, raising his eyebrows. If you two don't come in now, I'll mark you absent, Tewell said, waving the parchment in his hand, which contained the list of students for the class. Most of the names on it were shimmering with gold light, except theirs. George and Fred finally realized and hurried into the classroom. But the moment they entered, several golden letters appeared above each of their heads. It was their names. A layer of golden light emanated from these letters, resembling little birds flying out of their heads and returning to Tewell's parchment in his hand. The names on the parchment then lit up with a golden glow. However, their names above their heads didn't disappear, making it convenient for Tewell to remember their names. Awesome. Fred's eyes gleamed. Professor, I want to learn this. George looked at Tewell with anticipation, and Fred nodded beside him. It was a simple name magic, of course, with a bit of soul application. Tewell tucked away the parchment with a standard wicked grin. Trust me, even if you've done enough forbidden things, Dumbledore wouldn't be pleased to see you learning this. The students present suddenly felt a chill. Considering the information circulating in the hall today, the friendly Professor Tewell seemed less innocent than his appearance suggested. Instead, recalling the 2 previous annual professors who left due to teaching dark arts, they felt that Professor Tewell might end up in Azkaban by the end of the year. So, as soon as George sat down, he couldn't wait to ask, Professor Tewell, I heard you're this year's graduate from Durmstrang. Is that true? Tewell canceled the magic he set up at the door without looking back and replied, Mr. Weasley, remember to raise your hand next time you have a question. Then he turned around to face the students with the same question. Yes, I indeed come from that school. The classroom erupted into chatter. Professor, do you really study dark magic there? Will you teach us dark magic? Is the symbol of that man always present in Durmstrang? The students clamored to ask Tewell one question after another. Some even stood up directly and shouted loudly. Quiet. Tewell's voice wasn't loud, but to the students' ears, it sounded like it resonated through their souls. As his voice faded, the students were left stunned by its impact. After a moment of calm, they were surprised to find that they, along with the words spoken by their classmates, couldn't be heard. Are we deaf? Just as they panicked, Tewell's voice rang out again. You're not deaf. This is a small punishment for you. Remember to raise your hand before speaking. Seeing the students breathe a sigh of relief, he chuckled. Besides, Gryffindor and Ravenclaw each lose 10 points. Fred quickly raised his hand and found that speaking had sound again only after Tewell nodded. Professor, we don't even have any points now. How will you deduct them? The students chuckled with their hands over their mouths. Indeed, it's a problem. Let's keep track. 1 point deducted per day until your house points are sufficient to deduct, Tewell said, causing the smile on the students' faces to disappear instantly. About Durmstrang, I don't want to introduce too much in class. You only need to know one thing. Studying dark magic doesn't mean we are dark wizards, Tewell explained, feeling it necessary to clarify. He still wanted to be a teacher who was loved by students. As for Grindelwald, he paused, waiting for the students to be drawn in by the name. His symbol is indeed still present at the school, but his ideology is like the pure-blood ideology at Hogwarts, having many followers everywhere. This doesn't mean that all students support his ideas, especially since there are many students in the school who have lost loved ones because of Grindelwald. They've given a harsh lesson to students who thought it was cool to spread that symbol. So in my opinion, Durmstrang has simply replaced dark magic defense with dark magic research. Apart from that, there isn't much difference between the two schools. A male student named Roger Davis raised his hand. Professor Tewell, I heard that Durmstrang doesn't accept Muggle-born students. Is that true? You're right, Mr. Davis, because in our view, Muggle-born students find it difficult to resist the temptation of dark magic. Only when parents also provide magical guidance to students can they understand the true nature of dark magic. Seeing another student raise their hand, but not wanting to turn this class into a Durmstrang seminar, Tewell intervened. All right, you can ask me about Durmstrang later. We're officially starting our first class, and it's my first class as well. Speaking of which, I thought you would be more excited about this. So, who wants to tell me what we need to learn in defense against the dark arts? The question was too easy. Even George could answer it effortlessly. We need to learn how to use magic to protect ourselves from dark creatures and dark magic, and also learn offensive and defensive spells. That's right. So at the beginning of this class, I need to assess your grasp of magic. Tewell clapped his hands together, grabbing the attention of all the students. The quickest way is through combat, a fight between you and me. His lips curled into a smile, his eyes twinkling with delight. The students widened their eyes in shock, their pupils shaking like an earthquake, mouths gaping open. Don't worry, I won't kill you. Seeing the students' pale faces, Professor Tewell didn't explain. Instead, he smirked and waved his wand. All right, leave your books on the desks. Everyone grab your wands and stand at the back. The students suddenly found themselves able to speak, but they didn't dare to question loudly as before, only whispering in small groups. Can we run away now and seek help from Headmaster Dumbledore? With so many of us here, Professor Tewell wouldn't dare to do anything, right? He said he won't kill us, but that doesn't mean he can't harm us, like losing an arm or something. The students moved to the open space at the back, with Professor Tewell standing facing them, about 15 feet, approximately 4.5 meters away. Don't worry, this is a simple duel, just me against all of you. As he waved his wand, the ground softened, feeling like stepping on a mattress, and a thin membrane appeared around them, enveloping them gently. Some students tentatively touched it and found the membrane tough but softly catching their fingers. This discovery eased their minds. The professor didn't actually intend to knock them down. As you can see, the ground is now soft, so even if you fall, it won't hurt, and the membrane around you is for protection. Professor Tewell gripped his wand, performing the dueling etiquette. As long as you defeat me, not only will your deductions be waived, but your houses will also gain an additional 20. Stupefied, a red light suddenly shot out from the group of students, swiftly flying towards Professor Tewell, accompanied by Roger Davies's confident words. Professor, the duel has begun, hasn't it? But Professor Tewell chuckled lightly and effortlessly deflected the stunning spell with a flick of his wand. Very good approach. When facing a formidable opponent, ambush or catching them off guard is your only secret to victory. However, be prepared for counterattacks from your opponent. Before Davies could react, he was instantly bound by a rope and hung upside down from the ceiling. Instead of standing there dumbfounded, listening to Davies's screams, the students tightened their grip on their wands, their palms sweating with nervousness. But as soon as someone took the lead, more joined in. Besides, Professor Tewell was only 18, not much older or stronger than them, right? For a moment, the students chanted spells chaotically, various colored lights flickering in the classroom. Spells hit the membrane, dissipating. I'm glad you have such courage, but remember, don't stand there foolishly when casting spells. Even a pig wouldn't be that stupid. There's plenty of space around for you to run. Tewell casually suspended a girl who stood still, this time properly. The students were furious, but realized the importance of moving around. However, this decreased the accuracy of their spells significantly. Tewell didn't even need to defend. He just needed to take a couple of steps to dodge, demonstrating the importance of correct positioning. Don't hesitate when casting spells. Decisiveness leads to faster incantations. Even if it's dodged, you can swiftly attack again. Are you treating this like playing house with 3-year-olds? With a wave of his hand, he blocked incoming spells and cast a binding charm, restraining 2 people. That's a good idea. 2 people forcing movements with spells, while one focuses on attacking. But remember to protect yourselves, otherwise you'll be naked pigs. Professor, pigs don't wear clothes to begin with. So you don't even know how to cast protective spells? A barrier curse flew out, knocking the Weasley twins and a student named Lee Jordan out, only to be caught by the membrane outside, still unable to escape the fate of being hung up. Hearing Tewell's sarcastic remarks, the remaining students were infuriated, but they also consciously and voluntarily became more organized. Some released offensive spells, some tried to block the flying ropes, while others looked for opportunities to force Tewell into difficult movements. Very good. It seems you have grasped the secret of outnumbering your opponent, but you have forgotten the most important point. The students paused, then heard Tewell chant the first spell, Wingardium Leviosa. It was the levitation spell they learned in their first year, but they didn't feel the sensation of floating, nor did they see anything floating. Just as they were puzzled for a second, a tremendous pressure instantly filled every cell of their bodies. The young wizards who had learned Muggle knowledge knew instantly what this feeling was. Gravity had become stronger. Except for the students hanging from the ceiling, the rest collapsed powerless on the soft ground, unable to move even their fingers. Tewell intentionally controlled the output of magic, simply making them lie on the ground, then systematically hanging all the young wizards from the ceiling. If someone came in and saw this scene, they would probably think he had some unspeakable fetish. So Tewell closed the door. He found a chair and sat down, watching the spectacular scene in front of him. To be honest, I'm very disappointed in you, he shook his head. You've mastered very few spells. The most common are obstruction and disarmament curses, with only standard spell casting as the highlight. But your spellcasting skills are almost non-existent. You only know how to stand still and cast. You must remember, combat is not turn-based, but instantaneous, life or death. And finally, a group of people who seem to be scattered, only realizing coordination under the opponent's hints. We will inevitably encounter opponents stronger than us, and at that time, cooperation should be your first thought. Spreading out will only result in each of you being picked off one by one. It's simply a failure within failure. Dealing with a group of pigs would be less of a hassle than dealing with you. Tewell listed a bunch of their shortcomings, which only made them more infuriated as he spoke. The young wizards were only bound, not gagged, so of course they could speak up to retort. It's clearly because you, Professor, are too unfair. George weakly kicked his legs. If we had enough practice time and coordinated well, it would definitely be you hanging up in the end. Fred was also annoyed, swaying back and forth. The classmates echoed loudly. They had lost, but it was understandable since Tewell was a professor, and they were just third-year students. Losing face by admitting it wasn't a big deal. But Professor Tewell's words were truly infuriating, calling them pigs. Didn't he know that pigs were the least magical creatures? The students, filled with anger, kept accusing Tewell, but learning from past experience, they didn't dare to go too far, just murmuring their complaints quietly. At that moment, a faint voice sounded. I think I'm about to have a stroke. Can you please let me down first? Roger Davies was the only one hanging upside down, while the other students were just mentally uncomfortable, but he was physically uncomfortable. Seeing his face turning red due to blood rushing to his head, Tewell quickly used a standard levitation spell to release them all. He almost ended up in Azkaban for attempted murder of a student. Giving them some time to calm down, Tewell casually dispelled the surrounding magic. "I believe you've experienced a real battle. Please share your inner thoughts," Tewell said, still sitting on the table, observing the students who looked at each other without speaking. So he decided to call on someone. "Davies, I think you have a deeper understanding. Care to share some insights with your classmates?" As Davies was called upon, his neck stiffened and his flushed face paled slightly. He glanced around at the expectant gazes, confirming that no one would speak up for him. Then, hesitantly, he said, "Don't just stand there foolishly." "Exactly," Tewell nodded approvingly. "No matter how fast the opponent's magic is, its trajectory is straight. Well, mostly straight. This means that effective movement can dodge most spells. Of course, if you foolishly run towards a spell, even Headmaster Dumbledore can't save you." The students chuckled happily. "But there's another issue here. Who can guess what it is?" Tewell let the students laugh for a while before asking. George was about to speak, but Fred covered his mouth. "Raise your hand, you idiot." Then, Fred raised his hand, much to George's incredulous gaze. After getting a nod from Tewell, he spoke up loudly. "Professor, I think if we step on traps while running, it's as if we might as well have stayed still." Tewell applauded him approvingly. "Exactly, battlefield situations are often complex. When we maneuver, we not only need to pay attention to our opponents, but also to what's under our feet." Gryffindor gets 5 points. "It seems both of you have ample experience in this," Tewell said, nodding towards Fred and George, who proudly raised their heads, greeted by low laughter from their classmates. At that moment, the bell for the end of class rang, and for the first time, the students felt annoyed by how disruptive it was. They wanted Professor Tewell to share more about combat techniques. So cool. Teenagers in their puberty were full of eagerness to show off, eager to learn various combat skills now and replace Professor Tewell, who had just faced multiple opponents alone, with themselves. "All right, in this class, you've roughly grasped the 4 key points of combat: positioning, spellcasting speed, personal protection, and teamwork. But don't worry, we still have a year to learn these 4 skills. After a year, we can have another battle to test everyone's progress." The students' morale immediately soared. Conquer Hogwarts, capture Tewell alive. Tewell was very pleased with the students' enthusiasm, but why did it seem like there were horns growing out of his head? First is the first key point, positioning. Your homework is to think about how to maneuver effectively and how to render your opponent's maneuvers ineffective. The next one is for those willing to use their brains. There will be a small special reward for good ideas. He flashed a standard professorial smile, adding a bit more anticipation for the students. A few top students exchanged glances, their eyes gleaming with a fervor hotter than the battle itself. The reward from Professor Tewell, they had to win it. So, all you need to do is write a paper about your ideas. There's no limit to the length, even if it's just a few words. But please note, it must be your own ideas. No word limit was the sneakiest part. None of the students dared to submit a paper that was just a few words. They would always be worried about not having enough words. This way, they would end up writing longer and longer papers. Tewell clapped his hands, dispersing their reluctant emotions. "All right, that's the end of class. Hurry up and go. Don't be late for the next class." The schedule at Hogwarts was tight, especially since the next class was Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration. They would rather be hanging upside down than be late for Transfiguration. But Tewell had some free time now. He only had to teach this one class today, so the rest of the time was his own. Taking his copy of Wizard Chess Basics, Tewell leisurely walked through the castle toward the library. The castle was much quieter as students were in class, with only occasional sounds of spellcasting coming from classrooms. Likewise, there weren't many students in the library. There were always few students without classes, and even fewer who came to the library on the first day. He didn't choose books on wizard chess. Hogwarts' oldest collections dated back thousands of years, and it would be a waste to study wizard chess here. Instead, he picked up a book titled Spellcasting Techniques. Tewell glanced briefly at the contents of the book. It was quite simple, covering various spellcasting techniques, similar to what he taught in class. The only unusual thing about this book was its age. It was written 800 years ago. At that time, Hogwarts had only been established for 200 years, and such ancient books were usually kept in special collections. If Tewell weren't a professor, he wouldn't have been able to access it. Finding a corner near the window, Tewell began to read the book written in ancient magical script. Indeed, Hogwarts books were different. Tewell also found snippets about the four elements in this book. The author greatly praised the concept of the four elements, but, after years of research, made little progress. They could only rely on their own understanding to write this introductory level spellcasting techniques. It included various aspects of the four elements, but only had superficial insights. The only advantage was a particular statement. Mastery of the four elements did not rely on ancient magic. It transcended magic and was closer to the source of magic itself. No matter what method of spellcasting at that time, there were various methods of spellcasting, with ancient magic being just one of the more common ones, as well as methods involving blood for spellcasting, among others. They were all composed of the four elements. Tewell didn't know if this included modern magic, but it did make things easier for him. He had thought that learning about the four elements would also involve ancient magic. After all, the reason ancient magic declined was because it was difficult to learn and master. Even a seasoned scholar steeped in ancient magic for many years wouldn't dare to guarantee mastery of more than 10 ancient spells. It was like a Muggle trying to learn magic from textbooks. This method of spellcasting greatly restricted the number of wizards. In ancient times, only those with exceptional talent could become a wizard. So, although ancient magic was slightly more powerful, Tewell had no desire to learn it. After all, his skills no longer required the slight amplification that ancient magic offered. Modern magic could achieve the same effects. After spending an afternoon browsing through the entire book, spellcasting techniques, and searching the library, Tewell didn't find any more valuable books. So, when it was time for dinner, he left the library and headed to the Great Hall. However, the students' attitudes towards him had done a complete 180-degree turn. "Good afternoon, Professor Tewell." "Hello." Another unfamiliar student greeted him, and Tewell, suppressing his confusion, nodded and smiled. Just this morning, they were being critical of him, and now, in the afternoon, they were suddenly warm and polite. Professor Tewell didn't know when Professor Flitwick appeared, but he patted Tewell on the waist. "Tewell, I heard you hung up a class of students and fought them." Tewell felt he might have guessed the reason for their change in attitude. His bonding with the students in class had become widespread knowledge. Just a day was all it took for castle gossip to reach everyone's ears. Hogwarts truly lived up to its reputation. "It's just some teaching techniques," Tewell shrugged. "Seems the students don't mind." "The students not only don't mind," Professor Flitwick pretended to be mysterious, winking, "I was worried you'd be nervous on your first day. They're just a bunch of third years, easy to please," Tewell said with an air of authority, as if it were Professor Flitwick speaking. Smiling all the way, Tewell felt his face stiffening. He had only met them at last night's dinner, and today was the first day of school, yet it seemed like every student knew him as the new professor. But as soon as he entered the Great Hall, Tewell understood what Professor Flitwick meant. When the students saw him, someone let out a scream. "Professor Fawley, can't you consider hanging and flogging me as a fourth year too?" Well, that came from a rugged-looking boy. The Great Hall erupted in laughter, but the students' eyes were filled with anticipation, eagerly watching Tewell. "Professor, please teach us fighting techniques." "Please tie me up tightly, I don't mind." As for Professor Quirrell at the faculty table, he wished he didn't have to teach at all, spending all day figuring out how to deal with the three-headed dog. Fawley had only taught one class, so it wasn't as if he had made the students that excited. It's just that everything is relative. The same was the first class, and Quirrell's course was exceptionally boring. The classroom was filled with a strong smell of garlic, giving the students headaches. Not to mention the content of the course, where he just stuck to the script. Compared to Professor Binns, who taught magical history, he showed a bit more emotion. Whenever it came to spellcasting, he would ask students to demonstrate. Although he talked a lot, he never showed them himself, leaving the students to figure out on their own. But Fawley was different. Just that golden membrane was enough to earn praise from the Weasley twins for ages. And Ravenclaw's Davis almost became Fawley's fanatic fan, praising his abilities to the skies. In the eyes of the young wizards, from appearance to ability, Fawley was simply superior to Professor Quirrell. Fawley raised his hand, and the Great Hall immediately quieted down. Looking at the students, especially the older ones, with anticipation in their eyes, he waved his hand and pointed to Quirrell sitting at the faculty table. Professor Quirrell is responsible for courses for 4th years and above. Trust me, his abilities are more than enough to be your defense against the dark arts professor. He just hasn't shown it yet. Quirrell wanted to hide his abilities, and Fawley didn't mind digging a little pit for him. Now they were colleagues in every sense of the word, so why not? This move had a significant effect. Quirrell's previously smiling face froze. His mouth twitched slightly, not knowing what expression to put on to respond to the students' questioning gaze. The little commotion in the Great Hall dissipated, but the students were still discussing the charming Professor Fawley. "We still have a few days until Professor Fawley's class," Ron said, with a chicken leg in his left hand and a fruit tart in his right, his mouth never idle. "So you don't need to be so eager." "I'm not eager." Hermione, who was reading while eating dinner, lifted her head, furrowing her brow displeased. "Professor Fawley's first class is to test our abilities. If you don't even know a single spell, doesn't that mean we've lost at first glance?" Neville put down the chicken leg in his hand, looking hopeless. "That's it. I might not even be able to cast a complete spell after studying for a year." Harry listened silently to their discussion, feeling his heart tightening. During today's class, he was pleasantly surprised to find that his magical learning wasn't inferior to his classmates, except for Hermione, of course. Just hearing that the first defense against the dark arts class would involve a fight with a professor made George excited. Now sitting at the Gryffindor table, whenever Professor Fawley was mentioned, he would appear. "Don't worry, no matter how much you've learned, you'll still be knocked down by just one spell from Professor Fawley," George said confidently. "Maybe the professor can scare them off with just a wand wave." Fred chimed in with a mischievous grin. "But I heard you guys only took one spell from the professor, and then you were all hanging upside down." Ron blinked innocently, completely unaware of his accurate hit. The twins exchanged a silent look. "I think developing a kind of spider candy to turn people into spiders would be fun. Or we could fill the common room with spiders, so the Gryffindors could practice dodging in advance." "Dodging? Are you talking about combat techniques?" Hermione's curiosity was piqued. "Can you tell us more about it?" She was more interested in Professor Fawley's class content. As a diligent student, she always liked to preview before class. But for what she heard, it seemed that Professor Flitwick's class content didn't follow the textbook at all. And in her impression, there were rarely books containing such content. "Don't worry, you'll learn it. We have a whole year." George shook his head triumphantly. At present, only their batch of students had taken Professor Fawley's class, and the specific content of the course was unanimously kept confidential. These were secret techniques that could enhance their strength. Although when everyone had taken defense against the dark arts, they would know these contents. But by then, they would already be bonded by the experience of hanging from the ceiling together, so knowing wouldn't matter. Hermione rolled her eyes in dissatisfaction, no longer bothering with the sarcastic Weasley twins. But after Ron had eaten and drunk his fill, he suddenly said, "Aren't you worried that Professor Fawley might use dark magic?" "Impossible! How could a professor use dark magic on students?" Hermione retorted immediately. "But the professor is a standard Death Eater, so it's normal for him to know dark magic, right?" Ron frowned. In his mind, knowing dark magic equated to being a dark wizard, and a Death Eater who taught dark magic was the headquarters of dark wizards. George, on the other hand, became discontented. He gave Ron a heavy pat on the shoulder. "My dear brother, knowing dark magic doesn't mean using it. I bet Dumbledore knows plenty of dark magic too. Even if he's a dark wizard, it doesn't matter," Fred said with a fanatical look, "as long as he doesn't use it on us." Ron gave his two brothers a disdainful glance. "You guys were betting this morning on how long it would take for Professor Fawley to end up in Azkaban." Tewell wasn't aware of the students' compliments towards him, or rather, he didn't have the leisure to pay attention to them. He encountered a slight problem. The students highly praised the battle in the classroom, considering it the most valuable combat training they had experienced. However, some professors saw it differently, especially the renowned Professor McGonagall. I'm not questioning your approach. In fact, I'm pleased that Hogwarts has another professor skilled in combat. McGonagall began, pausing to choose her words carefully. But I hope you'll consider the students' abilities. Suspending them like that. She pondered for a moment, unsure of how to articulate her concern, so Tewell helped her out. Inappropriate? He offered. Yes, inappropriate. McGonagall nodded firmly. Simply restraining them would suffice, but suspending them from the ceiling might lead parents to believe that we're disciplining students harshly. Tewell was about to explain, but Dumbledore spoke up first. It's all right, Minerva. Tewell's approach is quite intriguing, he said, gesturing towards the enthusiastic students. As you can see, the students enjoy it. As for the parents, I believe they'll overlook such a small issue when they see their children's abilities improving, Dumbledore added confidently. With the headmaster's words, McGonagall didn't press the matter further. After all, if there were any complaints, they would likely reach Dumbledore's desk. Nonetheless, Tewell offered a brief explanation to avoid any misconceptions. It's just a way to discipline the third-year students and let them experience the harshness of battle, he explained. First and second years, forgive me for being blunt, but they are far from ready for actual combat. At most, it's just a game for them. McGonagall chuckled awkwardly. Just at the beginning of the school year, it's natural for first-year students to have lower abilities, and if they were too strong, it would raise suspicions. However, for the second-year students who have gone through a year of learning, to be honest, Professor McGonagall felt that their level wasn't much better than the new first-year students. Thinking about this, she discreetly glanced at the hesitant and evasive Quirrell. It's all because of such professors occupying positions in defense against the dark arts that Hogwarts students couldn't learn useful knowledge. Fortunately, this year, Albus Dumbledore seemed to have had a change of heart and hired an assistant, and such an outstanding one at that. But considering those rumors, she couldn't help but worry. Will Tewell only be able to hold on for a year before being forced to leave the school? Tewell paused, his hand holding the glass, wondering what he had said to make Professor McGonagall look at him with such concern. Professor Fawley hadn't considered so much. Tewell, you're teaching combat, but the students have learned very few spells. How are you going to teach them? Defense against the dark arts and charms are actually closely related. Charms class teaches students new spells, while defense against the dark arts teaches them how to use these spells to deal with potential dangers in life. So, the higher the grade level, the easier it is for students to learn defense against the dark arts, as they know more spells. But Tewell is only teaching students below the third year. So Professor Flitwick worries that the content of the class may not be rich enough for the older students, leading to dissatisfaction with Tewell. Tewell was prepared for this. Mainly, I'll teach them some spell casting techniques in class, as well as different applications of the spells they've learned. And if you don't mind, I'll also teach them some practical spells for combat. Of course not. Professor Flitwick chuckled. I don't know if you're good at transfiguration, but it's very useful in combat. Professor McGonagall's attitude towards Tewell became even friendlier, as if afraid they wouldn't meet again after this year. So upon hearing this, she turned her head to join the conversation. I wouldn't mind at all if Tewell could teach the students how to apply transfiguration. To be honest, many students don't realize the immense utility of transfiguration in combat. They always think of it as rather insignificant. Tewell was also quite helpless about this viewpoint. Except for Transfiguration Masters, few people recognized the significant role of transfiguration in battles. Coincidentally, his teacher happened to be a Transfiguration Master. Although the teacher often criticized him for favoring dark magic over transfiguration, Tewell's proficiency in transfiguration was unmatched by ordinary wizards. However, it remained unclear how strong Dumbledore, renowned as the world's best with only transfiguration, was in this regard. Sensing Tewell's gaze, Dumbledore turned to him and raised his glass. His deep blue eyes were as clear as a baby's, yet they were impenetrable even to Tewell, a legilimens master. I also look forward to Transfiguration being applied more, not just in battles. If Tewell needs anything, we could discuss it. I wouldn't dare to call it a discussion. Tewell hastily raised his glass in return. In front of you, I'm just a student. So, after dinner, Tewell followed Dumbledore to the headmaster's office. It was the same room as last time, with the same layout, and the portraits still gazed at them with scrutiny. Old people don't like changes. Dumbledore sat behind the long table, smiling expectantly. Tea or pumpkin juice? Tewell calmly sat opposite Dumbledore. Pumpkin juice, please. I seem to have fallen in love with this drink. As soon as he finished speaking, bottles of pumpkin juice on the table suddenly grew 4 legs and happily trotted over to him. The cups transformed from bottle caps, delicate and elegant, with patterns resembling flowing clouds. Watching this scene, Tewell couldn't help but smile knowingly. Dumbledore was asserting his dominance from the start. But I prefer a larger cup, if you don't mind. Without waiting for Dumbledore's response, the cup kept extending until it became a goblet, and the bottle's mouth automatically bent down, pouring out the rich pumpkin juice. Dumbledore's proud smile faltered for a moment. Non-verbal and wandless magic, combined with advanced transfiguration, Tewell's display was meant to impress this young professor. To prevent Tewell from becoming arrogant at such a young age due to his extraordinary abilities, Dumbledore didn't expect Tewell to immediately respond with wandless and silent magic of his own, and it was based on his transfiguration skills. It was like a nesting doll transfiguration, and Tewell turned out to be the one nested inside. However, the pouring of pumpkin juice didn't last long, because Tewell transfigured the goblet into an even smaller cup, which would overflow if more juice was poured. I just remembered that we just finished dinner, so it's probably best not to drink too much pumpkin juice. My darn competitive spirit. Dumbledore looked smugly at Tewell, who had a face full of black lines. It's okay, I'm still young. I could digest it well. Tewell's smile became even more triumphant. The cup returned to its original size. The next day, Tewell had a rare lie-in, but fortunately, he didn't have classes in the morning. Last night, after a childish yet ingenious transfiguration contest, he ended up losing, because Dumbledore shamelessly used the Elder Wand. His original strength was already stronger than Tewell's, and now, with the wand's amplification, even a teacher couldn't resist. They discussed until late into the night, with the dawn breaking before they finally rested. But it was mostly Dumbledore teaching and Tewell learning. Transfiguration is actually quite simple. Students in their 7th year can master 3 techniques: the transformation charm, vanishing spell, and summoning charm. Tewell was very proficient in this regard, but to use extraordinarily powerful transfigurations, achieving effects even stronger than regular spells, further study is required. For example, control over magical power to give transformed objects greater flexibility, incorporating magical properties into transfiguration, allowing transformed objects to have effects similar to spells. And in these aspects, Dumbledore was even more formidable than his teacher. Not that I'm saying my teacher isn't good. Tewell tried to divert the topic and headed to the Great Hall for breakfast. At this time, there weren't many students in the Great Hall, but as soon as he entered, all attention turned to him. Soon, curious young wizards crowded around him, asking about Durmstrang. Durmstrang requires us to have crew cuts. I wonder if Mr. Malfoy can handle that. We have fur cloaks and blood-red robes, depending on the weather. Yes, the weather is mostly cold, but some sturdy students choose not to wear cloaks. Here's an interesting fact. Quidditch is a worldwide sport, so we also have Quidditch teams, but they're not divided by houses. Instead, we form several teams. All right, students, question time is over. I need to start class. As class time approached, Tewell managed to leave the group of students. It seemed like most of the students without classes had gathered in the Great Hall, probably to hear Professor Flitwick introduce Durmstrang. However, he was willing to answer their questions, considering it a way to relieve the fatigue from last night's studies. I wonder when Professor Fawley will arrive. I heard he got surrounded by students in the Great Hall. Do you think he'll be late? But we came so early. Won't we miss his magical attendance charm? I don't care about that. I've been practicing several spells just for a duel with Professor Fawley. Second-year students were discussing eagerly about the upcoming class, filled with excitement about the possibility of a duel. After fermenting all day yesterday, they were looking forward to the afternoon class, even hurrying through lunch to arrive early at the classroom. "The professor is here," someone exclaimed, and the classroom instantly quieted down as all eyes turned to the door. Sure enough, a suave Tewell strode in a few seconds later, holding a paper bag in his hand. He was a bit surprised to find the classroom already filled with eager students. Glancing around, he confirmed it was indeed his classroom before happily walking to the lectern. To be honest, if it weren't for the fact that the bell hasn't rung yet, I would have thought I was already late. The students laughed with a sense of pride and joy, but the attendance step couldn't be skipped. Tewell waved his wand, and names appeared above each student's head. Then, amid their astonishment, the golden light above their heads flowed into the student roster in his hands. "Very well," he glanced at the parchment. "I don't think anyone would dare to skip my class." Tewell tucked away the parchment, meeting the eager gazes below. "Although you probably already know who I am, I'll still do a brief introduction. I, Tewell Fawley, your defense against the dark arts professor, do indeed hail from Durmstrang. However, I hope you refrain from discussing my alma mater in class. It's a rule for this course. As for your first lesson, I believe you all have a hunch." Cheers erupted instantly. But please note, Tewell raised his voice, drowning out the cheers. "Before we engage in combat, there's a less enjoyable step." As he spoke, he waved his wand over the paper bag, and exam papers flew out, landing precisely in front of each student. A quiz. The students slumped, their faces filled with disappointment. "Don't worry, the battle you're looking forward to will come afterward. This quiz is to help me understand your situation in more detail." Tewell conjured a giant hourglass for timing. "You'll have half an hour, so don't feel too pressured. Just write down what you know. Even if you don't know, I can teach you throughout the year." The hourglass turned, and the timing began. Everyone immediately immersed themselves in the quiz. Meanwhile, Tewell moved behind them, trying out the transfiguration techniques he learned yesterday. The questions were based on last year's textbook, with some additional knowledge summaries provided by him. He noticed from yesterday's class that the previous teachers had essentially covered the textbook, but how much the students had learned was uncertain. Combat only offered insight into one aspect, which was not comprehensive enough. So he deliberately created a set of exam questions to see how much they had learned in defense against the dark arts. The half hour quickly passed, as the exam questions were indeed not difficult. Those who knew the answers had finished writing long ago, while those who didn't were scratching their heads, unable to come up with anything. After waving his wand and collecting all the exam papers, Tewell said the words everyone was eager to hear. "Combat. I know you've been looking forward to this, so stand up and remember to take your wands." Voila! The students couldn't wait to put away their textbooks and, in an organized chaos, grabbed their wands and moved to the back. To their surprise, they suddenly saw 3 flittic professors. Triple the fun? Once they were in position, Tewell explained to them, "After yesterday's lesson, I realized that you, still have a lot of room for improvement. If I were to be your opponent, you wouldn't be able to unleash your full potential." Pointing his wand at the other 2 identical him, they immediately sprang to life, assuming a combat stance. "You'll be divided into 2 teams, each protecting one of me, and then try to defeat the other me as much as possible